I was thinking, who would be capable of such a heinous crime?
I was shielded from the raw details.
It did change the village at the time.
As a fledgling serial killer, and that's what he is, I'm glad that at least he was nipped in the bud.
On the morning of the 30th of October 1966, a discovery was made that was to plunge the village of Beenham into a nightmare that its inhabitants would have to live with for nearly half a century. The village of Beenham in Berkshire is only 51 miles from London, but in 1966, this rural community may as well have been a million miles away.
Back in the 60s, we all knew each other. It was more tight-knit than it is now. It's still a very close village, and everyone knows each other and looks out for each other.
In the 1960s, Beenham would have been a quiet village. We never got called up to there for any problems at all.
Early in the morning of Saturday, the 29th of October in 1966, police received a call about a missing 17-year-old au pair called Yolande Waddington.
Yolande had only been working at the farm as an au pair for a matter of days before she went missing and was then reported missing by her employer.
At the same time, a discovery was made on land belonging to the farm where Yolande was a nanny.
Some clothing was found in a barn by one of the farm workers. He thought no more of it because previously other clothes had been found there. It was a location used by courting couples.
Unaware of the clothing, police spread the word about the missing 17-year-old.
The following day, further items of clothing were also found within the barn when farm workers went and moved some bales of hay. At that point, Yolande had been reported missing, so the fact that the clothing was found in the barn, reasonably close to where she was living, raised suspicions, and her employer was called to the scene.
It didn't take long before everyone's worst nightmares were realised.
On the 30th of October, a body was found by her employer in a ditch close by to the barn where her clothing was found. She was naked, or almost naked. Her hands had been tied behind her back with twine, or baling twine. She had an item of clothing wrapped around her face and stuffed into her mouth. She had an injury to her rib cage just below her left breast, and she also had baling twine wrapped around her neck. And it was that what killed her.
1966 was a time before DNA and databases. All they had was good old-fashioned police work.
It was obvious from the outset that it was a murder, and it was treated as such.
Rodney Watson and Gary Deacon were local PCs at that time.
A telephone call came in to the effect that a body had been found in a ditch in a farm track at Beenham. It was quickly established that we had received a report of a missing girl called Yolande Waddington, and as a result, I, amongst others, went to the scene to secure the scene.
Murders weren't known in those days as such, so everybody was sort of rushing around trying to get things organised, and I had to go to sort of do the search that was going to be taking place at the scene. We were greeted with open fields, rural tracks, the barn down the road, and farm tracks, and basically all rural area. We were searching at the time with sort of what would be garden instruments, the rake, hose, garden forks, shears for cutting the grass.
The atmosphere at the scene was quite sombre. Obviously, it was realised that the body in the ditch was a female and matched the description of Yolande Waddington, and she'd obviously passed away.
You'd read about it in textbooks and everything, and you'd done it at a training school, but to be actually involved in a murder search was an experience.
I actually conveyed Yolande Waddington to the Royal Berkshire Hospital to the mortuary. I mean, I was thinking, who would be capable of such a heinous crime?
Identified by her employer, police were dispatched to give Yolande Waddington's family the horrific news. Giles, Yolande's younger brother, was 8 in 1966.
But I do recall this picture of opening the front door and finding a policeman in his full sort of uniform standing in front of me going, "I need to speak to your mum and dad." And that's the only real record I have. And then I have recollections of lots of people being in the house that were a bit unusual. And I would assume, in that case, there were various detectives.
This had been Yolande's first job away from the family home in Newbury, and despite only being in Beanham a few days, she was known as a friendly, talkative girl. News of the murder travelled through this country village fast.
I can remember the police presence. There were suddenly lots of policemen everywhere. When you came out of school or if you went to the village shop, there were policemen around, and it is quite memorable, something like that. It did change the village at the time then.
Berkshire was really a rural county, and apart from the normal problems that you had, maybe the occasional pub fights at the weekend, murders were unknown as such.
A call was made to London.
In 1966, it was standard practice for the Berkshire Constabulary to request the assistance of a Detective Chief Superintendent and a Detective Sergeant from the Metropolitan Police.
And it was felt that Metropolitan officers had the necessary experience and expertise in order to lead on these rare and serious offences.
With Scotland Yard on the scene, the investigation continued.
In the following days, a thorough search took place of the barn in the immediate area. Various items were seized. Sacks from within the barn, Yolande's clothing, a comb was found, a knife was found, which was believed to have been the knife that caused her injury.
The items were sent to the Metropolitan Police Lab in London for analysis, and then officers concentrated on piecing together Yolande's final movements.
Yolande Waddington was last seen on Friday the 28th of October 1966 in the Six Bells public house, Beanham. She got in there to buy a packet of cigarettes. She appears to have smoked one of the cigarettes within the bar and then left. That was the last time she was seen. It was always felt, I believe, that the offender would have lived in and around the Beanham area because of the isolated nature of where Yolande was found and the fact where she was last seen within the village centre. And therefore, investigators felt that the answer to who was responsible laid within the village. Everyone within the village was interviewed. The inquiry centred on who was within the Six Bells at the time she was, who left shortly after she did, and if they did leave, where did they go?
During their inquiries, officers began unearthing information that could prove crucial to capturing Yolande's killer.
The landlady of the Six Bells was interviewed. She remembers selling a packet of cigarettes to a girl fitting Yolande's description. A man by the name of David Burgess was in the pub at the same time Yolande was there. He'd been there the majority of the evening and left shortly after she did.
Just days after the brutal murder of teenager Yolande Waddington, police already had a suspect. In 1966, the rural village of Beanham in Berkshire was left reeling when the body of 17-year-old au pair Yolande Waddington was found naked and strangled in a farm ditch. Local police had been bolstered by the arrival of the Met Scotland Yard. Items belonging to Yolande found at the scene had immediately been sent for analysis, and after a few days, they already had a suspect, a local man called David Burgess.
He was of interest because he was in the pub, the Six Bells, at the time Yolande was there and left shortly after she did. The following day, he was seen with scratches on his face. He stated that he'd fallen into a bush on his way home. Police spoke to him. He stated he had been in the Six Bells and then had walked home from the Six Bells.
With nothing else to go on, 19-year-old local lad David Burgess was released and the investigation moved on.
Everyone within the village was interviewed to establish where they were on the Friday that Yolande went missing.
Over the next few weeks, the usually quiet village of Beenham was a hive of police activity as they hunted Yolande's murderer.
I can remember the parents being really quite concerned of us kids going out to play, and the people in the village were quite scared.
At the time, our school was just down at the end of the lane there, and we used to just run up the lane and round and home. But once this happened, then all the mums were always at the school to meet us and walk us home. The police presence outside the hall, they were always there every day, which was obviously quite strange for Beenham to have so many police around.
There's always ripples to any murder, but in a very small community, I think that those ripples are felt very, very keenly. Immediately, you start to look at your neighbour and feel suspicious, and immediately there's a fear of people who are close to you and known to you. This is not the kind of thing that happens to us. It's the kind of thing that we read about in newspapers or we watch in plots on TV or in Hollywood films.
After almost 2 weeks of inquiries, where over 1,000 statements were taken, Yolande's clothing and effects had been analysed. The results were to send the investigation in a direction that would end up making history.
During the investigation at the barn, her jumper was found. On that jumper was blood. When that blood was examined, it was found not to be hers. Following that, it was decided to request blood from every person, every male, over the age of 16 that lived in and around Beenham.
This was a bold move by police, as the science behind it was in its infancy.
Limitations of forensic science testing in the 1960s basically revolved around the limitations of testing for blood. We knew that there were 4 blood groups, and you could break it down a little bit more, but you could never rule somebody conclusively in as a suspect. You could only rule them conclusively out.
Progress, though, had recently been made.
In 1966, 2 forensic serologists working for the Metropolitan Police came up with what they thought would be a new technique that could be used for forensic applications. The new application would help to further distinguish individuals on the basis of their blood.
By early November 1966, police decided to push on with what became the first mass blood screening ever attempted in the UK.
Posters were put around the village inviting men over 16 to give blood and also showing a knife similar to the one found in the barn. Following the publication of those photos, David Burgess approached an officer within the village and told him that he wants to own a knife very similar to that.
Yolande's murder would have been very big news in a very small village. So here is a concerned citizen who is giving police information about a knife that they've recently lost. That's very helpful, but it becomes slightly more suspicious when you also factor into account that Burgess was also the last person to see Yolande alive.
Before a single blood sample had been taken, David Burgess had re-emerged as the police's main suspect.
David Burgess was arrested in interview. He stuck to his story. The fact that he was in the pub, he couldn't dispute that because other customers had seen him. And the scratches, he explained those by saying he'd fallen into a bush on his way home because he'd had too much to drink.
Despite letting him go again, David Burgess, who worked at the local gravel pits and was already known to the police as a troublemaker, soon became the subject of gossip amongst the local bobbies.
I was kept abreast of things through snippets of colleagues who were undertaking the parts of the inquiry teams, and and it became obvious that David Burgess was the chief suspect, although it was proving difficult to back up his claims with actually corroborative evidence.
Frustrated they couldn't prove Burgess's guilt, police continued looking into other local men.
My dad actually got arrested for the murder for Orlandi, because what happened was the bus stop used to be outside the Six Bells pub, and he was in the pub and he had a Land Rover, and he said to her, because he was tipping down around, sit in my Land Rover while you wait for the bus. And somebody must have clocked that, and he got arrested and taken in, but in the next day was released, so they know he never done it.
There are 16 men that were of particular interest to the investigation. However, one by one, those men were eliminated.
With the investigation floundering, police still had what they hoped would be the ace up their sleeve. On November the 23rd, 1966, blood samples were taken from every male between the ages of 16 and 50 living in Beenham.
In excess of 200 men had their blood taken. The type of blood grouping that was done was new.
This case was certainly one of the first times that mass blood screening was used. The most well-known instance happened in the 1980s, but this predates it by at least 20 years.
Police were hoping that identifying whose blood was on Yolandi's jumper would lead them to her killer.
They were able to say that only 2% of the population would have had blood of that type, and that was borne out by the fact that out of in excess of 200 men that gave their blood, only 4 people had the same blood grouping as that found on Yolandi's jumper.
Police were desperately hoping David Burgess was one of them.
It wasn't his blood on the jumper, or his blood didn't appear to match the grouping that was found on Yolandi's jumper, so there wasn't a great deal more that the police could do. With the 4 men whose blood matched the grouping of the blood found on Yolandi's jumper, they were all subject of intense investigation. All of them had alibis for what they were doing, and therefore were ruled out of the investigation.
It had been a massive gamble to take this unprecedented step in the investigation. Unfortunately, it hadn't paid off, and the police were back to square one.
The investigation were obviously limited as to what they could do forensically. They did all they could in relation to try and show who was at the scene with Yolandi, but back in 1966, they couldn't progress it.
With no new evidence coming to light, there was a difficult decision to make.
The investigation finished in March 1967. The officers had done all they could to try and establish who was responsible for Yolandi's death, but unfortunately, after almost 6 months, they had no evidence that could be used to charge someone with her death.
I imagine that the killer would be feeling that they'd gotten away with it, they'd been successful, and they'd be feeling quite a thrill from that. They'd be feeling empowered and invincible.
The investigation was never officially closed, and suspicions remained about David Burgess. But for now, the evidence from the scene was stored for future analysis. Despite all the police's efforts, the murder of Yolandi Waddington remained unsolved. After 6 months, the investigation into the murder of 17-year-old au pair Yolandi Waddington had been stopped. The village of Beenham looked as if it was going to be living with a killer on the loose for the foreseeable future. Inquiries may have ended, but despite there not being a match in the UK's first mass blood screening, local troublemaker David Burgess remained the police's prime suspect. This was a village on the edge. On the 17th of April 1967, the village of Beenham hit the news again.
We've got another call come in to say that 2 9-year-old girls hadn't returned home after going out to play in the village of Beenham. And we all thought, no, this cannot be. Surely nothing's happened to them. But I attended with a lot of officers, probably 20 to 30, and volunteers from the village, and we searched the area by some gravel pits, and having been issued with the whistles to blow if anything was found, after about half an hour or so, somebody blew a whistle.
The whistle could mean only one thing.
When the call came in to say 2 bodies had been found, then you get a bit disheartened, you think, how sad. And it was a lonely area, these 2 young children as they were out there on their own, and something had happened. Devastating, really, yes.
The awful news reverberated around the village.
We were really in shock, and the teachers were in shock, parents were in shock, and it was really quite scary, actually.
Police quickly got to work. They were determined that this murder would not go unsolved.
It was obvious that these 2 girls had been murdered, so an investigation took place.
It wasn't long before police had a person of interest, and the name didn't come as much of a surprise.
Because David Burgess was one of the main suspects in the Yolandes case, the fact that he worked so close to where the bodies of the 2 9-year-olds were found made him a strong suspect almost from the outset. He was interviewed, his clothing was seized, and from one of his boots some blood was found, and that blood grouping matched one of the girls.
David Burgess was charged with the monstrous killing of the 2 9-year-old girls, Jeanette Wigmore and Jacqueline Williams.
We'd heard that Burgess had been arrested on the possibility of committing the murders of the 2 schoolgirls, and I suppose we were all really delighted.
In July of 1967, just 4 months after the horrific killings of Jeanette and Jacqueline, David Burgess was presented at Reading Crown Court accused of their murder. It was a swift, uncomplicated hearing.
Burgess stood trial and was convicted of both the murders of both 9-year-olds in July 1967.
Escorted to his life sentence by Rodney Watson, Burgess's behaviour was, under the circumstances, bizarre.
And I was handcuffed to him in the dock, but most of the time he didn't really seem worried about what was happening. He kept on looking round, occasionally laughing, chuckling to himself, and not really worried about proceedings. And a very strange person I found to be in that position. I would have been worried myself. And then he was remanded in custody and then taken down and then released into the prison authorities. And that was the last time I ever saw him, in fact.
Now, I know that when I assess psychopaths, some of the things that I look for are callousness, lack of empathy, but just a general blunting of emotional response and effect. Now, here is somebody who is acting very oddly indeed. We know that he's not got a mental illness, but you have to question what else is going on.
Rodney's macabre introduction to the darker side of police work was over. But there was still one question that remained unanswered. Who had murdered Yolande Waddington? In 1968, a potential answer came from prison.
David Burgess admitted to being responsible for causing Yolande's death to a prison officer, and that prison officer subsequently made a statement to police.
Could the man who police had always suspected of Yolande's depraved murder be confessing?
On April 3rd, 1968, Burgess was interviewed in prison by police officers in relation to the admissions he'd made concerning Yolande's death. To those officers, he said words to the effect of, "You'll have to prove it."
The fact that somebody was prepared to indulge in this sort of conversation and admissions and them saying you prove it as if it was some sort of game, totally disrespectful to the girl and the family and the family of the 2 other girls.
In talking about Yolande's murder and taking responsibility for that murder, Burgess is meeting 2 needs. First of all, he's letting people know how clever he is because he's got away with murder. But also, crucially, is re-engaging with that murder and re-engaging with the emotions that that murder brought about in him. So he's feeling powerful, he's feeling a thrill. And let's face it, when you're incarcerated, there are very few other outlets for that type of thing. If you can't commit a murder, you talk about a murder.
Police decided to test Burgess's blood one more time.
Following his admissions, the jumper was tested yet again in relation to the blood found, and a report was submitted to the Director of Public Prosecutions. However, the blood grouping still didn't match that of Burgess, and as a result of that, the Director of Public Prosecutions stated that he didn't believe it was worthwhile pursuing the charge against Burgess.
It was a bitter blow, and it was looking like Yolandi's murder was never going to be solved. In 1996, 48-year-old convicted double child murderer David Burgess absconded from open prison.
At one point, Burgess was on the run for in the region of 18 months and took over the identity of someone that he knew that had died. He was subsequently arrested when he committed an armed robbery. We don't know where he was throughout the 18 months.
Sexual offending by its nature is addictive, and here is an individual who would be at very high risk of reoffending. But that's not to say that other murders would be inevitable, although they are possible.
When I heard that he'd escaped from an open prison, my thoughts were, how could somebody who's killed two 9-year-old girls be deemed safe to allow out into the public?
By February 1998, David Burgess was back in prison, whilst Beanham tried to get back to normal. But the village always had a cloud hanging over it.
There's a very good history of Beanham, which was written by the local history group some 10 years ago, but it doesn't mention the murders.
It was a subject that was almost taboo.
I would say I would very rarely hear anyone talking about it here in the pub.
As many tried to forget, Giles, Yolandi's younger brother, was just finding out the full horror of what had happened to his sister.
I discovered a pile of press cuttings hidden away out of view. Obviously being put away so that I didn't find them, but I did, and there was a sort of Yolandi's photograph plastered on the front page, and there were sort of police and other sort of articles. So I found out a little bit to know that my sister had been murdered.
With David Burgess safely back behind bars, advances were being made in DNA analysis, meaning previously unsolved murders were worth revisiting.
In 1985, research published at the University of Leicester proved that new DNA analysis techniques could be used to link specific individuals to offences, and has since been used in many different capacities to solve homicides and sexual assault cases.
This breakthrough led to cold case units being set up by police forces around the country.
I retired in 2007 and then came back in my current role as a member of police staff, reinvestigating historic cases.
Eventually, in September 2010, the Thames Valley Major Crime Review Team turned their attention to the unsolved murder of Yolandi Waddington.
So with Yolandi's case, we initially looked at what the case was about, looked at what case papers we had, and importantly what exhibits we had, and did an audit of those exhibits to see what was still in existence, and then did an assessment as to what potential there was to use new forensic techniques on those exhibits.
Could advances in forensic sciences finally help police find Yolandi's killer 44 years after her murder? Up until 2010, the 1966 murder of Yolandi Waddington remained unsolved, despite the police believing that double child murderer David Burgess had been responsible from the very beginning. Then Thames Valley Police decided to reopen Yolandi's case to see if DNA could identify and convict her killer. The new investigation began by finding out what evidence had survived.
We had items that were found in the barn, some items of her clothing, but importantly, what was missing was the oatmeal jumper that Yolande was wearing at the time of her death. That was an item from which a bloodstain was found, which wasn't hers, and it was that bloodstain, the grouping from that bloodstain, which was used on the initial investigation to get the blood grouping with which to match against people from within the village.
As the only item belonging to Yolande with someone else's blood on it, the missing jumper was a big blow.
There were another key items that still did exist, and it was those that we were able to submit to the forensic laboratories for further work to take place.
By January 2011, police managed to recover Yolande's headband and a plastic fertiliser bag. Now it was up to the lab to find DNA not belonging to Yolande.
We here at LGC have a cold case team that is dedicated just to cold cases. We'll use whatever available technology is there in order to try and help solve the case.
Locating the evidence was only half the battle. Usable DNA needed to be found.
One of the most important items was the polythene fertiliser bag that was found at the scene of the crime. Because the original note suggested there was blood on there, and obviously they'd got blood grouping results from that item. So we went back to it, and sure enough, there were still crusty blood stains on that item. We then sampled some of those stains and carried out DNA profiling on them and got a good profile.
The lab was quick to give Thames Valley Police the news.
And they said that they had a profile. That profile, a DNA profile that is, that profile was then searched against the National DNA Database, and there was a match against David Burgess.
Already in prison for double murder, David Burgess was in the frame again. But it did pose the question, why hadn't he been a match when he was tested in 1966 or 68?
I would have expected him to match if the test had been carried out correctly. And unfortunately, we can't go back and recheck that particular test, and we don't have any documentation in order to see whether there might have been a transcription error, a problem in moving information of the actual type onto another page that was used in a report, for example.
As far as the team were concerned, Burgess's blood had been incorrectly categorised in the 60s. But persuading a jury of this wouldn't be easy. They had to use the DNA to prove that the blood had always belonged to Burgess.
Although it was good evidence to have Burgess's DNA on that sack, the problem we had was that he was a local young man, would have had ready access to that barn, so we had to get evidence over and above that, because potentially he could have just said, yes, that's my DNA, I'm local, so what?
Roy Green and his team at LGC continued investigating the evidence.
As we looked through the old case notes that were prepared over 40 years previously, we noticed that one of them, the headband, had a description of it saying grubby, and that was it. But on examining the item, we found that what were thought to be grubby marks were actually blood. The DNA profiling results showed that there was a mixture of DNA on the headband. Some of it could have come from Yolande, and that's to be expected because it was her item. But also, some of it could have come from David Burgess.
If Burgess's DNA was definitely on the headband, it would show that he'd come into direct contact with Yolande. Police had to prove beyond any doubt that the DNA was his.
We had to refer to a specialist in genetic statistics at UCL, and he was able to say that, in his opinion, the DNA profile found on her headband was a 1 in a billion match probability to Burgess.
A 1 billion to 1 match was conclusive proof that Burgess and Yolande had had physical contact. It was time to let the surviving members of Yolande's family know what was happening.
I tend to try and only make contact with the family when we have new evidence, which hopefully will bring their case to a successful conclusion. In Yolande's case, I approached Giles, her brother.
There wasn't a sort of sense of relief, a sense of... I can't say that I felt anything. It's a process, and it still feels as though it's a process, because it makes no difference to the end result. Yolande is dead, never to be alive again. The bit that I was worried about was the impact it would have on my dad in his twilight days.
For the police, turning failed investigations around wasn't just about pride.
Each one of our undetected cases has obviously a victim and the victim's family. The impact on families is massive, in as much that it's difficult to comprehend what that family's gone through. And when we visit them sort of 10, 20, 30 years after the event, you can still see the impact, in as much that there's a picture of their loved one, either on the television, on the mantelpiece, and it never goes away. It's something that they think about every day.
My parents were certainly not wanting a repeat. Well, their trust in anybody disappeared, evaporated completely, for the simple reason that their precious daughter had been taken from them.
Pete Byrne and his team had to put together a case to back up the DNA.
It's really, really pleasing to get the forensic result, but that's just the start of it, really. From that moment on, we then have to look at the case and build the case up against Burgess.
Police had to painstakingly trawl through all the evidence from 1966 and find the original witnesses.
They were all seen, if they were still alive, interviewed, asked in relation to their initial statement, whether they wanted to add, alter or correct anything in relation to what they'd said back in '66 to what they could remember in 2011.
In November 2011, the prime suspect in 17-year-old Nanny Yolande Waddington's murder was interviewed about some of the original evidence from 1966 that had implicated him.
Did you get those scratches because Yolande scratched your face?
I had nothing whatsoever to do with her death. I've told you that, and you won't believe it because I'm a liar, you said. We're saying the knife that you lost is identical. You say you lost. Is identical to the knife that was used to murder Yolande Waddington. That's a coincidence, Sam, isn't it? Your missing knife is the same knife that was used. How many people in Venham had a knife similar? How many people? Are they all suspects, are they?
Finally, Burgess was asked about his confession to prison guards.
And you thought it was safe to say that here?
No.
It was safe, wasn't it?
I'd never say something like that if I committed a murder. I wouldn't go around shouting about it.
After we finished interviewing Burgess and he was charged, we then carried on building the case up against him, putting the file in to the CPS, and then getting ready for the trial.
45 years after he'd first been the main suspect in Yolande Waddington's brutal killing, David Burgess was going to stand trial for her murder.
It's not every day that you get told that your sister's murderer has just been arrested. It was a sort of sense of, wow, that's progress, and significant progress.
On the 18th of June 2012, David Burgess stood trial at Reading Crown Court.
I was confident in the results that we'd obtained, but in the background there was always this mistyping of the original blood grouping results that could be a potential stumbling block.
If the defence could sway the court into believing there was no way that the two blood tests done on Burgess in the 60s could have been wrong, he'd get off the murder of Yolande yet again. It was a difficult time for Giles.
There is no provision whatsoever for, or any preparation that can prepare anybody for facing a trial as a victim's relative.
For David Burgess, it all seemed nothing more than an inconvenience.
I saw him throughout the trial. His attitude didn't seem to have changed at all from when we'd first interviewed him. He just simply appeared bored by the whole proceedings.
The jury and Giles were told all the grisly details.
The fact that she'd been found naked, her clothes had been strewn about, she'd been stabbed, she'd been strangled, the whole thing had been a sexual crime. And that's the bit that was uncomfortable, because I found it out for the first time.
Through expert witnesses, the prosecution explained how the original blood tests must have been wrong, and more witnesses called.
One of the key points of the trial was a witness that we'd located in Australia, who was living in Beanham just prior to the murder. She gave evidence to the effect that Burgess had attacked her one evening prior to the attack on Yolande. We were able to use that evidence, what's called bad character evidence, put that before the jury to show the type of man Burgess was.
Once all the witnesses found by Pete Byrne and his team had given evidence, there was only the DNA left.
We're fortunate that the scientist was able to explain to the jury in layman's terms what that DNA consisted of and how he was confident that the DNA that was found on the items belonged to Burgess.
In the end, everything relied upon the jury understanding the complex evidence.
The trial lasted 5 weeks in total. The jury were out for 5 days, after which they came back with an 11-1 majority verdict that Burgess was the killer.
On the 23rd of July 2012, almost half a century after Yolande Waddington's murder, David Burgess was sentenced to 27 years imprisonment. It was a huge relief to Giles.
For want of the better expression, shouted from the rooftops to say, no matter how old the crime, the resources are now there to provide justice now.
He should be 92 years of age when he's released. I don't think he should ever be released.
Burgess is clearly a sexually motivated repeat killer, and you do wonder how his killing career would have been progressing had he not been caught. But as a fledgling serial killer, and that's what he is, I'm glad that at least he was nipped in the bud.
We're very, very pleased that we got the result, but that's what me and my team do. We reinvestigate the historic cases that are unresolved.
Burgess was sent back to prison, but questions were raised about the 18 months he'd been on the run.
We made sure that forces were also made aware of the fact that there was a convicted killer that potentially could have committed offences anywhere within the UK within that time, so we passed on his details to other forces.
By the time Burgess is eligible for parole, he will have spent 73 years behind bars for the 3 murders the police know he's committed. The question is, are there more?
Join the team and face the day-to-day struggle of stamping out crime. Leave it to the experts, Saturday at 10 in the Force North East.
Hampshire Fire and Rescue received a call.
The house was really ablaze.
Fire officers, when they went upstairs, they found a naked female. There was blood on the walls. She had some cable ties wrapped around her wrists, and she had stab wound injuries to her neck.
I screamed and shouted and cried. I felt like half of me was gone.
I wouldn't have expected something like that to happen in this area. You just really feel for those children that have now got to grow up without a mother.
3 men arrived at her dress, trying to break in, and had threatened to strangle and have sex with her.
We got told by CID that they had somebody that they thought murdered my sister.
On the south coast of Hampshire, on the Fareham Peninsula, lies Gosport. Once the base for the Navy supply chain, this picturesque town acts as a commuter hub for Portsmouth City across the harbour.
So Gosport, I'd say, is quite a quiet place to live. It's got a lovely coastline, and it's quite good for families. There's quite good connections to schools around the area, and you can quite easily get across to Portsmouth, to Gunwharf. Yeah, I'd say it's quite a nice, relaxed place to live for families and also the elderly.
Gosport really does have its own identity. The only way you can get there is either on ferry from Portsmouth or a couple of roads coming in and out of Gosport, so you very much feel like you're on the peninsula there, kind of isolated.
I think there is quite a different culture. It seems it's quite separate from Portsmouth because of the water.
We've got a really good leisure centre, lots of nice pubs, and there's always a park just literally round the corner. And you can get anywhere on a bicycle as well, because we've got fantastic cycle tracks here. We have a lot of people from all over the world really living here, and plus because it's naval, it just really has a lot of people here that are from all walks of life, really.
You have areas where the housing is very close in, rammed together, and you have others, bigger, larger houses with the more affluent.
In Gosport, especially with this road, you definitely could knock on any door and ask for help, definitely. And a lot of people have lived here all their lives.
Which is true of 27-year-old Kelly Ann Case, who was born and spent most of her life in Gosport.
When we was growing up, she was very bubbly. She loved to do dancing. She loved sports. She was very fun. We used to like doing like rollerblading when we was younger. We would do like all different activities, even if it was just walking to the beach and just acting like big children. Even though we was probably 15, 16, she would love it. We would argue and bicker, but it would never last very long. We would always make up within about half an hour.
But Kelly had to grow up quickly, after she fell pregnant in her teens.
Kelly was a very young mum, but she never pictured herself having children, but she told everybody it was the best thing she ever did.
But being a single mum didn't stop her from finding the time for love.
She was always lucky in love. Sometimes they didn't work out for many reasons, but she was always careful with who she loved and who she didn't love. She was actually on her own for a while because that's what she wanted. She wanted to be on her own, but in past relationships, she has been very lucky in love. She would always make people laugh, and she would always be like the highlight of the day, no matter how down you was or how low you was. She would always make you laugh.
Police, where's your emergency? I woke up and I opened the window, got the kids up like you normally do, and then could smell a really strong smell of burning. It wasn't a normal smell of burning. I could see smoke coming out from the house.
The residents of a quiet street in the north of Gosport awoken to a house fire.
Hampshire Fire and Rescue received a call from a couple of builders that were in the area that saw smoke billowing from the address in Grange Crescent.
The house was really starting to go ablaze.
The builders were working in the area and they noticed some black smoke billowing from the address of Kelly's. And concerned that somebody may still be in there, they started banging on the windows trying to raise the alarm. There was no response, and Hampshire Fire and Rescue arrived at the scene fairly quickly.
There was probably 4 or 5 firemen in the back garden, which is very, very tiny. The glass was starting to smash. They were in and out of the house, obviously with the hoses going and trying to put the fire out.
Kelly's house is ablaze. And as neighbours watch, all thoughts turn to her children.
Because I'd seen the children going in and out every so often, and I was thinking, oh no, I hope they're not there. I hope nobody's there. That's what my worry was. I wanted to know if the kids were there because it was just a bit heartbreaking, really.
fire crews break through the front door.
They found 2 areas that were alight in the ground floor of the address and then searched the rest of the premises.
The fire crews search the front bedrooms and find no one. But then they make their way into the back bedroom.
And it was inside there that the firefighters found the very shocking and grisly discovery of Kellyanne Case's body in her bedroom.
Firefighters are suddenly confronted with a horrific scene. Kelly has been the victim of a brutal and sadistic attack.
Fire officers are used to going into dangerous situations and dealing with traumatic incidents, but when they went upstairs, they weren't expecting to find what they saw, which was a naked female tied up with multiple stab wounds and an obviously slashed neck. I mean, it was pretty traumatic.
What immediately happened then was the firefighters alerted the police whilst they tackled the fire that was still in the house.
And over the next 2-3 hours, more fire engines and police cars. The road was pretty much full. And everyone was talking about it on Facebook and on what's happening down there.
News spreads across the community and reaches Kelly's family.
I immediately rushed to Kelly's house and then spoke to the police officer and asked whether it was my sister's house, and they confirmed that it was. 2 CID officers come up to me and my mum. They both turned around and said that there is a body and it is deceased. I kind of screamed and shouted and cried.
Police believe there's no time to lose if they want to catch whoever was responsible for Kellyanne's killing.
Because of the way Kelly was found and the significant injuries that were so obvious, it was called as a murder investigation very, very quickly. And so we take control of the scene immediately. We try to identify who the victim is.
Detectives realised that the fire was set deliberately, potentially to destroy evidence.
We noticed there were 2 seats of fire initially. One was in the kitchen and one was in the living room, and it looked like bedding had been piled up and deliberately set alight. Upstairs in the back bedroom, Kelly was lying on the bed, naked. The bed was completely stripped. She had some cable ties wrapped around her wrists. She had some obvious stab wound injuries to her neck. Her face looked like it had taken some kind of physical assault as well. And there was blood on the walls and on the floors.
Police believe that the motive for the murder could have been sexual in nature.
I think when you find a female naked in bed like that, tied up with cable ties, the assumption one has to make is that this is possibly a sexual assault. The pathology is then carried out. Can we then confirm that?
The situation of Kelly's body and the manner in which she was attacked leads investigators to consider a terrifying possibility.
Well, there's certainly a number of lines of inquiry and hypothesis that a senior investigating officer would form at the beginning of any homicide investigation, and one of those would be that this is a stranger attack. This is somebody who is not known to Kelly.
In the coastal town of Gosport, police are investigating the murder of 27-year-old mum of 3, Kellyanne Case. Her body has been found after her house was deliberately set ablaze.
Kelly was stripped, she was tied up, and she was tortured and then brutally stabbed with a knife.
Detectives believe that the sadistic and sexual nature of the murder suggests it could have been a stranger who killed her. And so they have to consider a terrifying prospect.
When we commenced our investigation, we contacted the National Crime Agency to see if there are any outstanding similar offences anywhere in the UK that we could liaise with those local police forces and share information with.
With the police having to consider this could be the work of a serial killer, at the scene a major incident is declared, and the street has been secured.
We had tape going from the end of the road all the way across, down that end, and then they cordoned off all the way down the bottom, all the alleyways at the back. Yeah, it was just literally everywhere, tape everywhere. Even
all the little alleyways that
yeah.
go in between the houses had.
Yeah, because you've got a little alleyway there, and they were just cordoned off, didn't they? Yeah.
The news that a young woman has been brutally murdered stuns the close-knit community.
When we found out it was a murder, that was horrific. That sends alarm bells, you know, because you don't know who it is.
Covering Gosport, there's lots of low-level crime that goes on. There are lots of break-ins to houses and sheds and outbuildings. But deaths and murders are very few and far between and send shockwaves through the community when they happen.
It's just really sad that I wouldn't have expected something like that to happen in this area. And especially for a young woman who's kind of around our age, it definitely makes me feel quite uncomfortable. And you just really feel for those children, 3 children that have now got to grow up without a mother.
Whenever any murder happens, it has a huge impact on the community, particularly if the suspect is outstanding. So people are worried, who is it? Why have they done it? And will they strike again? So our job as the police is to try and reassure the community that, you know, we are working hard to try and catch the killer and that we will do that as quickly as possible.
Suspecting that this could be a stranger attack, officers start house-to-house inquiries, and a neighbour steps forward.
During our inquiries, we came across a witness who did identify a male that he saw at about 5 to 7 on the morning of the 30th of July, who was just in the area of Grange Crescent.
A neighbour had reported seeing a sort of a scruffy, unshaven person near Kellyanne Case's home.
Described as looking a bit odd, surveying the premises, wearing a cap. And he said he's sort of driven up and down that road about that time for the last 10 years and never noticed anyone before. So this person definitely stood out for him and seemed suspicious.
Who was this man? And did he have anything to do with Kelly's death? But before detectives progress further, a check on Kelly's property uncovers a worrying development, which places their theory of a random stranger attack in doubt.
What was strange is that there was no sign of forced entry. The back door was unlocked, which would either suggest it's someone incredibly lucky trying doors, or somebody knew that Kelly was there and that the back door was unlocked.
Had Kelly known her killer? Or was it just pure chance that her door was unlocked so early on a weekday morning? The investigation shifts and focuses on Kelly's life circumstances.
In any homicide investigation, we would carry out a victimology, which is looking at the detail of the life of the victim, which includes, you know, previous partners, potentially people having an affair, issues at work that we might uncover. So it's quite common for us to go through the victim's history with a fine-tooth comb.
As detectives question friends and family, they uncover that Kelly was going through a difficult period in her life.
Kelly struggled with a lot of different things in life. She was always open and honest with people, but when she did struggle, sometimes Kelly did drink.
She'd fallen on some difficult times. She'd recently had her children taken off of her by social services on a temporary basis. She had issues with alcohol and drugs, and I would describe her as vulnerable.
The investigation also uncovers elements about Kelly's lifestyle.
I mean, Kelly was well known. She had a wide circle of friends. Her neighbours weren't big fans of hers, if I'm honest. She would have regular visitors to the address, 3 or 4 parties a week.
She used to have parties with music and stuff.
I had seen quite a few people going in and out of the house, obviously just thinking they were just friends.
Often police would be called to excess noise issues, antisocial behaviour issues, and she would probably hang around with the wrong people, I would suggest.
As officers investigate further, evidence shows that Kelly had been threatened just a few months previously.
Back in March 2019, Kelly had had some kind of party at her address. There was an altercation there where the male ended up with a fractured jaw. And as a result of that, Kelly received some threats by family members of that man. And she had to flee the address for her own safety. So she left the area for some time and returned to Gosport a couple of months later.
I think she left for about 3-4 months, but she couldn't be without her family, so she decided to come back.
But with the threat still hanging over her, Kellyanne's neighbours noticed a change in her demeanour.
She kept herself to herself. She used to hang around out her front door having cigarettes, and you'd walk past her and she wasn't very chatty, but we didn't see a lot of her, to be honest.
No.
heard a lot of her, but didn't see a lot of her.
Police believe Kelly Ann was vulnerable and involved with some unsavoury characters. And after interviewing friends, key information points to a potential lead.
She had had this row the night before with one of her friends, so that was key that we identify who they were. We wanted to establish what the row was about and who was involved. So lines of inquiry were set in relation to identifying those individuals. But we also found out through her phone that she'd been receiving threats from 3 men who had arrived at her address, were trying to break in and had threatened to strangle and have sex with her. This was told to one of her friends. And obviously through house to house, we'd established that people had been at that address during the evening at various times. So again, it was really keen to try and identify those individuals quickly because they may have some vital information, or they may be the killer and they may have vital forensic evidence on them still.
Could any of these people have something to do with Kelly's death? But before detectives can follow the leads, they get an unexpected call. A 32-year-old man called Will Vallender comes forward.
My sister was actually seeing Will Vallender at the time.
We believe that one of Kelly's family contacted Will Vallender and they notified him of the death. It then quickly dawned on him that he was possibly one of the last people to see Kelly alive, having left her address at about 6:30 that morning. As soon as Vallender made contact with the police, the decision was taken to arrest him on suspicion of Kelly's murder and seize his phone and his clothing so that we could then forensically examine those. One might question, well, if he's rang the police, why would you arrest him? Surely he's got nothing to hide. But if you flip it the other way and think, well, actually, he's got things to hide and he's now trying to give a reasonable excuse as to why his DNA may be at Kelly's address or on Kelly, and he's getting his story in first before the police catch up with him.
But Vallender's connection to Kelly and his ultimate link to her murder is about to point the investigation in a completely new direction.
He was obviously jealous, and he decided it was his turn to go and see Kelly and have sex with her.
In Gosport, police are investigating the murder of mum of 3, Kelly Ann Case, who was found stripped, bound and stabbed after her house was set on fire. The day before she died, Kelly Ann told her friends that 3 men had turned up at her house, threatening to break in and rape her. Police also have a report of a suspicious man loitering outside her house in the early hours of the morning. But all attention has fallen on Will Vallender, who has been arrested on suspicion of Kelly Ann's murder.
When I found out Kelly Ann was murdered, I felt like half of me was gone. Some CID officers come to my mum's house and told my mum everything that happened and that it was murder. And then my mum sat and read a piece of paper to me and my siblings of what actually happened. We got told by CID that they had somebody that they thought murdered my sister. We didn't actually know who it was at the beginning.
Police have arrested Kelly Ann's friend, Will Vallender, who came forward saying he'd spent the night with her before she died.
When Will Vallender was in custody, he was interviewed by detectives, and actually he gave a very detailed account of what his movements were the night before Kelly's death. And he explained that he'd been drinking most of the day. I think around midnight time, he received a phone call from Kelly. She was quite upset. She said she'd had some people round earlier in the evening. She'd fallen out with one of them, and could he come round?
He was out in Gosport and he was with his friend, Brendan Rowan Davies.
So Brendan was a friend of Will Vallender. They would meet every now and then, and on that night, Kelly called. Will had been out all day drinking with Brendan, and Brendan decided to tag along. So they stopped off, bought some vodka, and then went off to Kelly's, where they consumed the vodka and also had some cocaine.
After drinking and taking cocaine, Vallender says he and Kelly Ann went to bed, leaving his friend downstairs.
What Will Vallender then said was that him and Brendan Rowan Davies then left the home of Kelly at around about 6:30 in the morning.
Both Will Vallender and Brendan Rowan Davies left her home alone. They caught a taxi back to Vallender's house, and then Rowan Davies said he was going to go back to his home as well.
With Vallender claiming that Kellyanne was alive when he and Brendan left, police need to build up a full picture of what really happened that night. Key to this is interviewing his friend.
Officers were tasked to go and locate Brendan Rowan Davies, again, somebody who would have been the last person to have seen Kelly before she was found murdered. They went to his home address and there was no response.
With no sign of Brendan, Vallender tells the police that he'd spoken to his friend earlier that day.
Vallender had contacted Brendan Rowan Davies to tell him to contact the police as well. And the fact that Brendan Rowan Davies didn't makes that extremely suspicious in my view.
What had happened to Brendan? Was he afraid to speak to the police? While the investigation unfolds, the community is coming together to pay their respects.
People kept coming down the road, laying flowers, laying teddy bears, candles. Her sister was there quite a lot, and it was just really sad. I felt for the children more than anything.
When Kellyanne Case's death was formally announced by the police and she was identified, there was an outpouring of grief for this young mum, and that sort of materialised with a fundraising campaign to raise money, which ultimately raised about £1,300 for her funeral.
As the community mourns, the investigation is centring around the last two people who saw Kellyanne alive, and police have made a second arrest.
So within 24 hours, the police located Brendan Rowan Davies. He was with his brother over in Portsmouth. Police were dispatched and he was arrested on suspicion of Kelly's murder.
Rowan Davies' response to the police when they mentioned the murder or death of this woman was, I had an idea about that. Apart from that, he said very little. He was taken into custody. He was questioned and he just replied no comment to the questions that were asked.
With Brendan refusing to answer any questions, detectives turned to CCTV analysis to verify Vallender's account.
Because Vallender gave a detailed account of his movements with Brendan Rowan Davies on the way to Kelly's address and also leaving there. So we were able to establish, following the route that Vallender said he took with Brendan Rowan Davies, various CCTV points to identify the two of them together.
The footage shows Vallender and Rowan Davies taking a taxi from the end of Kellyanne's Road at 6:30 a.m. The taxi drops them off at Vallender's address 10 minutes later, where they're seen crossing the car park. 20 minutes later, Rowan Davies is seen heading towards his flat, arriving back at just before 7 a.m. Vallender's account of his movements seems to be true. But then, police analyse what Brendan did next.
Brendan Rowan Davies made his way back to his home address. We had cameras in that area that then picked him up about half an hour later, leaving his home address, but this time in a change of clothing, which is suspicious in itself.
Brendan is captured on the bus CCTV. But where is he going?
So having picked up the suspect on the bus, we know he got off just outside Cambridge Road, and so we're able to then scope the area for CCTV. Unfortunately, we came across CCTV in the kebab shop just behind me on the corner of Cambridge Road and Brockenhurst Road.
Brendan is seen walking back towards Kellyanne's house, just over an hour after leaving it.
The CCTV places him at the house for about 40 minutes.
Well, we believe that when Rowan Davies led himself into the address, he crept upstairs and Kelly was likely to be asleep. You know, it was the early hours of the morning. She'd been up all night partying. And he let himself in, and I think at that point he then held a knife point and then tied her up and brutally beat her. And then some 40 minutes later, he's then picked up again on CCTV, heading back towards his home address.
But he doesn't head straight home. Instead, he walks to his mother's house, a short distance from where Kellyanne lives.
So we know that around 9 o'clock in the morning, Rowan Davies returned to his mum's address, where he then changed his clothes and then left that premises with a bag, and he was seen heading along this footpath. 2 hours later, a witness came forward who found some burning remains of clothes, which we then recovered.
Further CCTV evidence shows Brendan retracing his steps home.
We then find him at his home address on CCTV going to the bin shed area. But this time he's carrying 2 bags, one blue one and one white one, and he disposes of them.
Police immediately search his property and the bins.
What they find is a pair of knickers, which they believe to be Kelly's, and also some training shoes that have some blood on them.
Police also find items which match those found on the victim.
Kelly was bound up on the bed and she was tied up with some cable ties around her wrists. We found some further cable ties at the address that matched the same description of those found around Kelly's wrists.
Having uncovered both the means and the opportunity to commit the murder, the investigation turns to a potential motive and who this prime suspect is.
The connection between Rowan Davies and Kellyanne Case was mainly through Will Vallender. Rowan Davies appeared to be this sort of hanger-on, this kind of tagged-along friend. You know, the two knew each other, or knew of each other, but I don't think they were ever close friends particularly.
He was a big man. He was 6'3", quite a strong man. We understand he had a low IQ, about 50 or 60, and he also had learning disabilities, including dyslexia. He was known to the police. He had about 6 previous convictions, but the most alarming one was a previous conviction for burglary of a house he broke into where the female was still on the premises. So a really concerning MO, I would suggest.
Detectives believe they have their killer, and when forensics return, it confirms their suspicions.
We then get the forensic results on the cable ties that were found around Kelly's wrists. And they have Kelly's DNA on them, obviously, but they also have Rowan Davies's DNA on them. So we went to the Crown Prosecution Service with all the evidence that we'd amassed against Rowan Davies, and they agreed to charge him with the murder of Kellyanne Case.
Will Vallender is released without charge, and a trial date is set for Rowan Davies. But when he gets his day in front of the jury, his account of what happened suddenly puts the case in question.
He said he was grabbed by a masked man who was armed with a knife, who threatened to kill him if he told anyone what he'd seen.
In Gosport, Hampshire, police have charged Brendan Rowan Davies with the brutal murder of mother of 3, Kellyanne Case. CCTV footage shows that after spending the night partying with Kellyanne and her friend, Rowan Davies returned to her house on the morning after. His DNA has been found on zip ties used to restrain her, and the blood found on his trainers is Kellyanne's. But he denies murder. Whilst police believe they have a solid case, they also have concerns as the trial approaches. As not only was an unknown man spotted loitering outside Kellyanne's house on the morning of the murder, but she had recently been threatened.
The fact that we had these issues, these unknowns of potentially people threatening Kelly in the past, death threats to Kelly, people falling out with her, that was the biggest concern, is that we needed to convince the jury that Brendan Rowan Davies was the person responsible.
The trial gets underway at Winchester Crown Court.
The atmosphere in court for the trial at the beginning was tense. Obviously, there were family members and friends of Kellyanne Case who were anxious to see justice be done.
I was at the trial the whole 4 weeks in Winchester. I was there with many family members, including my mum, who never ever missed a day. It was very tiring, but it was all worth it It helped me to try and grieve for her because I didn't want to grieve for her. I didn't want to believe it. And still to this day, I still feel sometimes that she's going to walk through my door, and she's not.
The pressure is on for Hampshire Constabulary, especially as Rowan Davies, who had remained silent during the investigation, has made some concerning claims to his defence.
Prior to the trial, the defence issue us with what's called a defence case statement. And what Brendan Rowan Davies was saying was that he did go to the address on that night with Will Vallender. He did leave with Will, but when he got home at 7 o'clock in the morning, he realised that he'd left his tobacco at the address. And so he went back to Kelly's to retrieve his tobacco. He said he found the back door left open, so when he went into the address, he went upstairs and he saw Kelly on the bed, naked, but she was unconscious. And then he was grabbed by a masked man who was armed with a knife, who threatened to kill him if he told anyone what he'd seen. He said he was so terrified he left the address and didn't tell anyone.
Could Rowan Davies be telling the truth? Was there an unknown masked assailant involved? But on examination, police believe there are major holes in his story.
He was cross-examined by the QC for the prosecution, and things just didn't stack up with his defence. The fact that he'd gone into the address and then suddenly this unknown masked attacker had grabbed him but not harmed him at all, so there was no injury to him, that didn't stack up. He then tried to explain why his DNA was going to be on Kelly and why Kelly's DNA was going to be on him by the fact that he was then pushed onto Kelly. The cable ties that Kelly had around her arms were the same ones found at his home address. He couldn't give an explanation for that. The change of clothes he had with him at the time that he went to Kelly's that he then changed into when he went to his mother's address, he couldn't give an account for that. That didn't make sense.
He claimed to have been absolutely scared and frightened by this mystery man, but CCTV footage from inside the bus that he took when he went home after killing Kellyanne Case showed that he wasn't petrified. He went to his mum's house afterwards and didn't say to her that he was scared at all. He said nothing to anyone until he had to suddenly defend himself in court.
By Rowan Davies' account, he left Kellyanne alive but unconscious with the masked assailant at 8:30 a.m. But just 3 minutes later, builders noticed smoke coming from Kelly's house.
The timings of Rowan Davies' account don't stack up.
In court, there was a lot of disbelief as to what Rowan Davies was actually saying.
Under cross-examination, Rowan Davies is asked how the masked assailant could have tortured Kellyanne, killed her and set fire to the house in the 3 minutes after he left.
His whole case was that within about a 3-minute window, this mystery man had murdered Kellyanne Case, and that Rowan Davies had walked off terrified, too scared to tell anyone about it. Rowan Davies' whole case seemed to be ludicrously implausible, just didn't seem to have been able to happen at all.
I thought Brendan's story was rubbish. This third person would not have allowed him to walk out of the house. You're not going to allow a person that have just witnessed you kill somebody, you're not going to allow them to walk. And in that space of grabbing his backy and then walking out of my sister's back door, not running, walking.
Whilst Rowan Davies' account is under scrutiny, the prosecution know they need to establish a motive for murder.
Brendan Rowan Davies clearly had some sort of sexual interest in her. It emerged at the trial that he'd said to her that he'd always fancied her.
But she just laughed that off and didn't take it seriously.
Kelly would never have a relationship with him, and Brendan didn't like that.
An analysis of Rowan Davies' phone also shows that he had followed the couple when they went to bed.
What Will Vallender and Kelly didn't know was that Brendan then, knowing that they were having sex in the room next door, got his phone out and started secretly videoing them having sex on his phone.
They said he used his arm put round the door kind of thing whilst he was filming that. He later deleted it, but this was a man who'd just been rebuffed by her with a laugh.
Will Vallender describes that he had left the house with Rowan Davies at 6:30 in the morning.
Will asked Brendan to make sure that the back door was locked, and Will would make sure that the front door was locked and post the keys back through. But we now know that Brendan didn't lock the back door, so he could gain entry when he come back.
CCTV then shows how Rowan Davies had made his way home, changed clothes, and returned to Kellyanne's house. The prosecution say he's armed with a knife and zip ties. He enters the house through the door he purposefully left unlocked.
It was quite clear that Rowan Davies had gone back there with a sinister intent.
When Rowan Davies led himself into the address, he crept upstairs and Kelly was likely to be asleep. And I think at that point, he then held her at knife point and then tied her up and brutally beat her. He was obviously jealous that Will Vallandern had sex with Kelly that night, and he decided it was his turn to go have sex with her. And she probably put up a fight, fought him off, and that's when he stabbed her.
In court, it's revealed that the knife wounds Kellyanne suffered were likely to be from an attempt to torture and control her.
When the pathologist gave evidence at the murder trial, he told how Kellyanne Case had suffered some horrific injuries, and he had to show sort of CGI reconstructions of these and stab wounds and slash wounds to her neck. She did also have broken ribs, broken bones in her body from what it emerged at trial may have been a panicking Rowan Davies who tried to sort of revive her.
We did get told in trial that she would have felt it and it would have been very painful. She had multiple stab wounds from her chest to near her hips, just basically prodding her with a knife. And he cut her throat 7 to 10 times. It has played on my mind a lot, but she would have bled out really fast and she wouldn't have felt it after a couple of minutes because her whole body would have just gone numb.
The prosecution say that Rowan Davies then stripped the bed and used the bedding to set the house on fire. He then walked to his mother's house, where he changed into clothes he brought with him, and later goes to a nearby alley to burn the ones he had worn to kill Kellyanne. But he does keep one item: a pair of women's underwear.
And one might think this is possibly a trophy that Rowan Davies has kept as a result of this horrific crime. He had taken them believing that they were Kelly's when in fact they belonged to a friend.
Rowan Davies is cross-examined for 4 days, and his account of Kellyanne on the night before she died is one of concern.
He was talking about things like how he was consoling Kellyanne Case because she wanted to, according to Rowan Davies, sort of kill herself that night because her children had been taken away from her.
It's then disclosed to the jury that Rowan Davies had been convicted of burglary 2 years previously.
He'd actually gone into a Gosport mum's house, kind of barged his way into the door, and the mum and children had to barricade themselves in a bedroom upstairs. But when the mum and her children came out, they found a butter knife that was on the stairs. When he was arrested for it, he was telling the police that he had heard someone was burgling the house, and that's why he'd acted and gone in, painting himself as a good Samaritan. And it was so shockingly similar to his defence case in the murder trial that it wasn't him, it was somebody else. I think that was a really chilling moment in the trial.
But the defence have one final seed of doubt to cast. The account of the 3 men whom Kelly had said were threatening to break in, rape and strangle her just a day before she died.
There is this fly in the ointment, was these 3 unknown people that had allegedly threatened Kelly 24 hours before that, threatened to break into a house and sexually assault her, and we never identified those individuals. I would suggest they probably didn't exist and were part of Kelly's paranoia at that time. As laughable as his defence case statement was, what was concerning for me is that there is a fly in the ointment there, for want of a better word. And all the defence need is to cast reasonable doubt around the account that the police say had happened, and then Brendan Rowan Davies walks.
After 3 weeks of hearing the evidence, the jury retires to consider the case.
The courtroom is an emotionally charged area at the best of times, and when you know the jury are coming back with a verdict, everyone is on tenterhooks, you know, waiting for that verdict, and you hope as a police officer it's going to go your way, and you hope for the family it's going to go their way as well.
The jury returns to the courtroom after 4 hours of deliberating.
After 16 days at trial, the jury came back unanimously with a guilty verdict of murder. And Rowan Davies was sentenced to 30 years imprisonment.
I was intently looking at Rowan Davies and I saw him just sort of shaking his head as the foreman read out the guilty verdict.
When we found out that he was sentenced 30 years without parole, my family and me was happy that we got the justice for my sister, but it was never going to bring her back. I personally think that he is vile, he's disgusting, and I hope to God I'll never see him again. I think he's a very, very sick individual that should never ever be released.
I believe if you take a life like that and you murder someone so horribly, I think you take a life, you should serve life.
Yeah, life should be life,
Life
not
should be life.
not 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, whatever it is, or you can get out of good behaviour and stuff like that. Life should be life.
It doesn't seem like justice. She was young, she was only 27, and she would have had years and years with her children, so it doesn't seem just in what she's lost and what her children have lost in years and what he's getting for that, because he'll come out and he would be a middle-aged, late-aged man, and he can still do things with his life, and that's something that she'll never get the opportunity to do.
After 2 years, Kellyanne's family are slowly coming to terms with their loss.
Us as a family have lost a big part, especially my mum and her children. They've lost their mum, and my mum has lost her daughter. Kelly was always the happiest and the kindest and the caring out of all of us. And I would always like her to be remembered for the person she was and not for what he did to her.
And Killer in My Village continues with the story of a 29-year-old who met a brutal demise at the hands of her ex-husband. True crime every weeknight at 11 on Sky Mix.
It's an emergency. I've just walked in and found my mother's body lying there, unstately dead.
It was fairly obvious this was going to be a big story.
We spent millions of pounds on this investigation, the most expensive investigations that Hampshire Police have ever run.
That type of thing doesn't happen around here. Why was this little old lady killed?
This is a murder.
Nestled beside the River Itchen sits the pretty hamlet of Brambridge.
Brambridge is typical of these tiny little hamlets that have got very, very few homes there. Everyone really knows everyone. It's a very friendly kind of place, and you've got your little store, and all community life is around those areas. It attracts a lot of visitors simply because of the River Itchen. There are lovely walks along the river there. Again, one of the most beautiful spots in England. Brambridge is most definitely one of the loveliest.
This picturesque part of Hampshire often attracts a slower pace of life.
It was always predominantly sort of an elder generation place, so people around here were sort of over 50s, 60s.
The community is an aged community. It's not an awful lot of very young people. There are some young people, of course, homes with kids and so on, but the majority of the community is older people.
The Hampshire Hogs, as they're known, they're very proud of their area. The local people who have been here for generations. And, yeah, like everywhere where it's village life, it's lovely.
At the very edge of Brambridge lived a wealthy 77-year-old grandmother, Georgina Edmonds.
Everything that was said about Georgina Edmonds was just a lovely, lovely lady. Well-liked and loved by everyone that knew her, very close to her family, very friendly, and just a charming old lady.
She had grandchildren that she really enjoyed playing with, was always up for a bit of a laugh. Her grandson was a budding filmmaker, and he would make funny little videos at Christmas, and Georgina would star in those as well. And she enjoyed life, you know, she was still very independent, she was still mobile. She drove her car, she would go down to the shops, but she had assistance with that as well.
Well, I knew her because one of the jobs I did at work was, you know, to take the groceries to the dear old souls who couldn't get around. I know she always had her little dogs with her, rather sweet little things. Very, very friendly. They used to stand up at the window and look out of the window. She was a, you know, a delightful person, and nothing to say about her that wasn't nice.
Georgina lived in a large gated estate on the edge of the river.
The Edmonds family were well known in the area. It was Georgina's husband who had founded the family business importing coffee.
Very well-to-do family. Harry, her son, worked in London. The business, I believe, was in Basingstoke. But again, most of the time, they were up in London working hard and would come back to Hampshire at weekends, you know, for rest.
When Georgina's husband sadly passed away, she downsized into the smaller house on the estate.
She moved into the cottage, which is your chocolate box cover cottage itself.
Nice little house, you know, amongst the trees, by the river.
Her son, Harry, took over running the business and moved into the larger house, as you would when you reach an older age. You don't want the bother of all the dusting.
Georgina seemed happy in her new home. But in January 2008, life in the community changes forever.
Police emergency. This is an emergency. I've just come down to my house. My mother has a cottage 100 yards away. Right. I've got no reply from her. I've come in through her bedroom window, which was unlocked. She's lying on the floor in the kitchen, and it looks to me as if she's been hit over the head. She looks as if she's dead.
OK, calm down for me, sir. What's your name?
My name is Harry Edmonds. I'm her son. I've just walked in. I came in through the window, and I found the house in complete darkness. I've gone through into the kitchen and found my mother's body lying there, and I've been out walking her dog. This looks like a crime scene to me.
OK, well, try not to touch anything for me.
This is a murder.
OK, just calm down for me, sir. I'll send someone else for you, OK?
Yeah, please, as soon as possible. I'm she's dead. That's a murder.
It was about 6:15. I was at home, just prepping dinner, and my phone rang, and so I answered the phone, and they said, we've got a suspicious death. I said, OK, tell me about that. And they said, it's an elderly woman been found dead in the kitchen, face down by her son. So I jumped in the car, and it was a miserable, wet, cold January night, blowing a gale, driving through these country roads as we are now.
Paul Barton, Detective Chief Inspector at the time, arrives at Georgina's address, which is already swarmed with a significant police presence.
So just as I'm pulling down here, I can see the blue lights sort of flashing in the pitch black. So I know I'm getting close to it. And then I just come around the bend, and there's some more police activity. A police van and a police car, an ambulance, and some tape here, just across the bridge here. So I just pull in where I'm pulling in now, actually. I walked up the drive. It's a short walk up a gravel drive into the cottage. The kitchen door is on the side of the cottage. I just looked in, I could see, sadly, Georgina was lying there face down with a large amount of blood around her, some stab wounds to her neck. So I was satisfied at that point that we did have something that was a suspicious death.
A murder investigation is launched, and police maintain a secure perimeter in and around Georgina's home.
You only get one go at recovering evidence from a body, and one that is already compromised. There will be a lot of discussion about what should be sampled at the scene, what should be done at the scene, what is going to be compromised by another action. So there will be a lot of effort going into preserving as much evidence as possible.
I actually want this road completely closed. And it's one entrance in, one entrance out, but I didn't want anyone else coming across in. I certainly didn't want the press turning up and having a look. And so immediately what we call a wider cordon was put on, and we blocked the road so that we had complete control of the area.
That morning, we went out for a walk, and as we crossed the road where it leads to her house, there was a policeman standing there. There was a car, the road was blocked. And I said, "Can you tell me what's happening on this road? There's been a murder."
When the news broke, it was fairly obvious from the beginning that this was going to be a big story. Neighbours would phone the newsroom and say, "Can you tell us anything about what's going on?"
Everybody was talking about it, wherever you went, everybody in all the shops. And there were police everywhere, and you just wouldn't generally see police presence in that area.
The 15 years that we've been here, we haven't seen or we haven't heard of a murder, except for this one. This is the first one.
I think that was quite worrying, because, why? Why was this little old lady killed? What was the reason? So it just seemed very, very random and horrible.
It became very obvious very quickly that this was a murder hunt that was out of the ordinary, shall we say.
So what led to a murder in this peaceful village? And why would someone want to kill a well-loved member of the community?
Police emergency.
This is an emergency. I've just walked into the kitchen
Okay,
and found my mother's body lying there. This looks like a crime scene to me. This is a murder.
In the picturesque village of Brambridge, the close-knit community has woken up to the news that a much-loved 77-year-old grandmother, Georgina Edmonds, has been brutally murdered in her home.
It's extremely grim. My mum was 77 at the time and living with us, not very far away. So, yeah, you don't even want to think about it. It's gone from being a quiet village scenario to then being sort of on the local news, everybody talking about it, what's happened, that type of thing doesn't happen around here.
With a small community in fear of a killer in their midst, it's down to DCI Paul Barton to address the public.
A Saturday morning I was doing my first media briefing, and it was packed, and it was Sky News Live, BBC Live, it was headline news, it was Midsummer Murders, kind of 77-year-old lady murdered brutally. So the nation were interested and the media were interested.
Under a national media spotlight, Hampshire police are under pressure to work out who would kill Georgina Edmonds and why.
I just start sort of kicking into autopilot. The next thing I'm thinking is, well, who's done this? Who's responsible? Any suspicious incident calls in that area in the last 24 hours? Has the victim been a victim of any other crimes? Is there any sort of domestic violence within the household? What do we know about the rest of the family? What do we know about the neighbours?
Was this a stranger murder? Was this someone, though, that she knew? And in such a small village, how did they get in and out of the cottage without being seen?
With a killer on the loose, the finger of suspicion is on every member of the community.
everybody asking questions. We had so many people come in the pub at the time. You know, did you hear anything? Did you see anything? Do you know who it was? You know.
We go out as the media and knock on doors and try to talk to people and find people that would have known her. When you've only got 5 homes to actually knock on the door, the community, they'll be in shock themselves, actually, about it.
With Georgina's son, Harry, too distraught to speak, it was left to neighbours to speculate what had happened. Had someone targeted her because of her wealth?
They had a beautiful house, they had quite a bit of money in the family. And I just remember that, you know, the money, the big house, the jewellery. It was in a dark, secluded area.
There was nothing else there. There was another house, I think, to the right, I seem to remember. But that's it. She was on her own.
Police conduct a thorough search of Georgina's house for clues.
We were exploring what could have happened. Was it burglary that was the motive? Her credit card had been taken. I believe also a Radley handbag was gone. I think a laptop was gone. But there were other items that were there in the kitchen that were quite valuable. There was monies out, I believe, that were just left. And that seemed rather strange, that this was a burglary that had gone wrong, that the burglar hadn't taken those fairly obvious items that were there.
Police take a closer look at the crime scene, and one significant thing jumps out. There's no sign of a forced entry.
Was this a cover-up? Was it another motive? And so, therefore, had she been targeted in some other way, and it was a pretend burglary, taking just a few things, when a real burglar would have taken lots of things.
With no sign of a break-in, everyone known to Georgina is under suspicion. Could the local community offer clues as to who Georgina may have let into the house?
Trusting, you couldn't have had anyone more trusting. She was that sort of person. She never disputed things, you know, she just trusted people. And sometimes people are a bit suspicious, but she wasn't that type of person.
She was the sort of person, and I guess this is of her age, that would keep her door unlocked. You know, she would talk to strangers. If someone knocked on the door and asked for directions, she wouldn't be suspicious. Probably even offer them a cup of tea and, you know, spend time with people.
With no obvious break-in, detectives are left to speculate whether this was a random attack by a stranger or by someone closer to home.
Quite often, the last person to see the person alive could be the killer. It is odd that a son comes home and finds their mum dead in a kitchen. I've dealt with other jobs where children have killed parents. You know, they may have been off their face on drink or drugs. There may have been a domestic argument that's then gone too far. He could have had an axe to grind with his mother, and he could have killed his mother, and then he's just made up that he's come in and found her dead.
Police reanalyse the 999 call made by Georgina's son, Harry.
I've just walked in and found my mother's body lying there. This looks like a crime scene to me. This is a murder.
It's a strange call, I have to say. He's very calm, but he says she's dead. I think it's a murder, he says. And I remember, you know, we played that time and time again, and it's gone out in the media as well. And, you know, a lot of people thought that was strange.
Police bring Harry in for questioning to establish his movements in the hours his mother was murdered. He tells detectives he was at work all day and did not return home till 6 p.m.
He was concerned because he hadn't heard from his mother all day, and I think he'd been trying to call her. And he went to the cottage and it was in darkness. Harry's managed to force open the ground floor window, I think into Georgina's bedroom. He climbs in, goes into the kitchen and finds Georgina lifeless on the floor in a pool of blood.
Harry's story is quickly verified. Police are still no closer to establishing who had gained access to Georgina's home. So they release CCTV footage of Georgina the day before her death, which shows her holding a handbag, which is now missing, and urge the public for help.
To be honest, most people were pretty appalled anyway just the fact that an old lady had been murdered without knowing the detail. And generally, everyone was trying to be as helpful as they possibly could.
Well, it was a huge community thing, and they had big things in the village hall. So everyone got together, they all went out searching. Everybody was sort of part of it. Everybody searched, everyone went and looked, and yeah, all together really as a community.
Despite the community's best efforts, Georgina's handbag isn't found. But post-mortem results help police identify the cause of death. Could this lead to clues as to her attacker?
On one level, the death of Georgina Edmonds pathologically is straightforward. She has been struck on the head with a heavy blunt object. Ultimately, it was identified that that was a marble rolling pin. A heavy weapon, a good sort of thing to use to cause damage. But on top of that, you then have the incised wounds, the cuts to the body, inflicted with a degree of deliberation, and you don't really have defensive type injuries. One conclusion that could reasonably be drawn is that if they're not in a place where they are likely to kill you, that they are an act of torture. There is an attempt to distress somebody and extract information.
Police now believe Georgina was tortured before she died.
It was horrific.
Terrible.
And as more details came out about what the guy had done to her, apparently tortured her, I mean, it got worse and worse.
Eventually, it emerged just the horrible scale of the injuries to Georgina that were allied to trying to find out her PIN number for her credit card.
We established about 5 hours after discovering her body that somebody had attempted to use that Cashpoint card at a local ATM. And we feel that they were trying to get the PIN number out of Georgina.
Police trace CCTV from that local Tesco ATM in nearby Eastleigh, only half a mile away from the murder scene, and see someone attempting to take money out.
They attempted to use the machine a couple of times. I think it swallowed up the card and off it went. So we didn't have a facial image of the person using the ATM machine, but we were confident to say it was a man. And in particular, the user of the ATM machine was wearing a thick fluorescent jacket with a hood up. And the person that approached that clearly knew that that camera was there because they took all reasonable steps to avoid being seen, keeping their head down, keeping the hood up, etc.
Despite his face being hidden, detectives now have an image of Georgina's killer, and the search for this person intensifies.
This is probably someone who was local or had local connections with Eastleigh. Have we had any offenders that have been released from prison recently in that area on licence? Have we got any registered sex offenders or violent offenders that are in that area? Luckily for me, the duty detective sergeant happened to know that there was a bail hostel called Elderfield House, which was pretty much at the end of the road from Brambridge leading into Otterbourne Village. It's the sort of place that you wouldn't expect to find in an affluent village like Otterbourne or Brambridge, and there are some unpleasant people there.
Behind those trees is Elderfield.
You can just see the rooftop over there.
These are people that had done time in prison, and after their term was over, they sent them here.
It was a halfway house, basically.
It's a halfway house.
It was somewhere where they could sort of spend time and sort of rehabilitate and get back into normal life. And they would hang around in groups and get very drunk. And it was not nice. It was quite a bit unsettling.
It is of some concern in that you don't know what's going to happen next.
You would often get some of them escape, or they would then get out and they aren't supposed to be out. Danger, I guess it was described as.
Police question the residents of Elderfield to establish their movements on the night of Georgina's murder.
There were 4 people that were unaccounted for that night. I think 3 had come back late. Within 24 hours or so, we declared 4 people as suspects from Elderfield House. And we arrested them, searched their rooms, brought them back to the police station, forensically examined them, and then put them through the interview process.
After hours of questioning, it soon becomes clear to detectives that 3 of the suspects had clear alibis and are released without charge. But the 4th did not return to Elderfield for 24 hours during the night Georgina was murdered. And his clothing is of particular interest to police.
CCTV showed this fluorescent jacket, which was really key. And in our search in Elderfield House, we established that one of the residents who was unaccounted for on the night was wearing a big fluorescent jacket. He had previous convictions for murder or manslaughter. And so he was of particular interest and excitement to the team at that time.
But police are able to verify the 4th man's alibi, and he is released without charge. And with no suspect or clear motive, fear begins to escalate across the local community.
It's unsettling. It's unknown because the police don't tell you exactly what's happening, especially when they say, well, we haven't found him yet, we're still looking out for him, So where is he?
It was quite scary. My family were saying to me, don't go out on your own at night, don't go out to the car park on your own. It definitely makes you change the way you behave, the way you think. For ages, people didn't go to the garden centre. That was really affected by the whole situation, because I just think people thought it was a dangerous area to go to, so they didn't go there.
They were getting more and more concerned and worried that this is someone still here then, is it? Are we to believe that this is a stranger or someone that was passing through, just happened to pick the cottage, just happened to find that the door was open, going there, carry out this terrible crime, and then just drive away and leave the area utterly and completely, and that's it? Or is it more likely that the perpetrator is still here amongst us?
It's been 1 month since much-loved grandma, Georgina Edmonds, was found murdered in her home in Brambridge, and police are yet to charge anyone for the heinous crime.
It was in the media daily, any newspaper stat you saw it. It was on the news, it was on the radio. We had boards up everywhere, and if you lived in the area as well, you couldn't miss it. Everyone knew what was going on.
I think at the time there was an urgency to get this one done, to get it sorted.
The only sighting detectives have is by a Tesco ATM machine in nearby Eastleigh. And so the investigation to find this man spotted on CCTV escalates.
We knew that Georgina's card had been attempted to be used, then obviously that, for me, becomes an area of concentration for house to house. So we had police patrols in the area, certainly at the Tesco Express. We wanted to capture anyone that was there at the material time, so we obviously pulled the CCTV from the petrol station itself. We could read all the registration numbers of the cars coming in. And then we had the obvious houses sort of adjacent to Tesco Express and then right opposite. And so I decided that we would focus house to house in that area as well, knocking on doors. Again, good old-fashioned detective work.
And it isn't long before one address catches police attention.
There was a raid on a house that wasn't far from where the cash point had been, where the person in the frame had been using the debit card.
There was a particular address not a million miles away from the ATM machine where a man lived up until the point of around about the 11th of January and then disappeared. The inquiries that we did identified that he was Polish and had gone back to Poland. And he may have also had some previous convictions, so I sent a team out to Poland.
Suddenly, the news story goes international.
We had reports that the police had actually gone out to Poland to carry out inquiries.
There was a lot of media interest in this particular case, and then the media were descending on us, and they would put two and two together and come up with murderer fled to Poland and all this. Got the community kind of excited, if you like, because they were thinking, oh, great, they finally caught that person.
Police question the Polish man regarding his movements on the night Georgina was murdered. Have they finally found their killer?
He was alibied, and also I think through DNA as well, we were able to eliminate him from the inquiry.
With the Polish man in the clear, Hampshire police are back in the UK and back to square one. So they release a clearer version of the CCTV footage to the public and suspect the person is a male aged between 16 and 60 with an estimated height of 5'11". The hunt for this man accelerates to new levels.
We wanted DNA swabs from males matching that description to come forward. Our view was, if you've got nothing to hide, come forward.
You can't force people to do that kind of thing. But what this did, of course, was to add to the suspicion in the community. But they would have come forward because feeling, well, if I don't, then suspicion's going to fall on me. I must admit that, in my experience, I've never come across a mass DNA appeal anywhere that I've worked before. It was certainly turning into something that's, well, a modern-day thriller.
More than 2,000 local men have their DNA swabbed, but there are no immediate results, and the case goes cold. Two and a half years later, and Georgina's killer is still at large. But on the 30th of June, 2010, things take a dramatic turn. An arrest is made. And it's a local man. 31-year-old Matthew Hamlin.
We scramble to find out who this man is. He's got a history of violence, and he's not a nice guy to know.
Matthew Hamlin was known to police. He'd been known for drug usage and also violence in the past. He had a off-on relationship with a local girl. In fact, he'd had an argument with her and resulted hitting her with an ironing board, and she moved out of the home. He had quite a bad drug habit at that time, using cocaine, and we understand he also racked up numerous debts as a result of his drug usage. And so that kind of fitted the profile of somebody high on drugs, desperate, and probably not really thinking what they're doing.
You can understand that the police would be interested in him. He used to walk his dog along the riverbank there and would know the area quite well. So he fitted in one of the profiles, shall we say, for the police.
But what exactly led to Matthew's arrest?
One particularly interesting subject came to them with a couple of bits of evidence. The first was that despite he denying that he had been in the area on that particular day and time, his phone records were showing that he actually was there.
This person had a mobile phone, and what we could show was that their phone was bouncing off the same cell mast on the afternoon of the 11th of January.
With Hamlin in custody, police waste no time in recording his every word when his mum visits.
The other thing is I might have an alibi for it as well.
What do you mean?
When they first interviewed me, I ain't got a clue where I was. And Sarah got out her diary and she flipped through, looked at the date, and she said, yeah, you was with me.
I can speak to Sarah.
Yeah. See if she's still going to make that.
I think she was trying to be helpful for him. And I guess, if you think about it, you don't want to think your child is responsible for doing such a grave crime. And so I would imagine she was desperate.
But I haven't spoken to them for ages. I haven't fallen out of them, but I ain't spoken to them. So whether she's still going to say that or not, but I can't remember it. I was off my head all the time. I was drunk. I don't know what I was doing. I don't know where I was 2.5 years ago. I struggled where I was last week.
It was quite clear in that recording that he was trying to manufacture an alibi at that time that would take him out of the area at the material time when Georgina was murdered.
As well as Hamlin's mobile phone pinging on a nearby mast, linking him to the scene, new evidence comes to light, which police believe is even more conclusive.
The other bit was partial DNA that was found on the rolling pin, and also, I believe, on a small part of her clothing. That was a partial match to this particular subject, putting the two together, and he came right to the top.
Eventually, the scientists were able to show some components of that mixed profile were 2,600 times more likely to be attributable to Matthew Hamlin. We were fairly confident that Hamlin was responsible.
After a manhunt that lasted years, it seems police have finally found their man. And Matthew Hamlin is charged with Georgina's murder. Matthew pleads not guilty, and 10 months later, the trial begins at Winchester Crown Court.
You're nervous, you're excited, you've got the victim's family up in the gallery, your QC opens up the case, you hear what's being said, and you sit back and think, that sounds pretty good. You know, if I'm on the jury, I'd be thinking, guilty.
The prosecution lay out a mountain of evidence against Matthew Hamlin. And after a 3-month trial, the jury returns with its verdict.
When the call came through, I remember the news desk saying to me, it's not guilty. At that moment, it was one of those moments in the newsroom where you get that stunned silence.
They don't happen that often. So when they do, and when it's such an important case like that, you can't really describe it. It's just a punch in the guts, you know. Yes, professionally, you're disappointed for yourself, you know, and your team, but it's the family, you know, you really feel for. And you know, you do question, could we have done more, you know? Did we have the wrong person, you know? Is there somebody out there that's done this that we haven't caught?
And you think about the community. The community had lived with this for 4 years. They believed that the monster amongst them had been caught and was now going to get his just desserts. And now it wasn't. And according to the court, he's not the monster at all. Well, who is the monster?
Despite a 2.5-year manhunt and becoming Hampshire Constabulary's most expansive investigation, Matthew Hamlin has been acquitted of Georgina Edmonds' murder, leaving her family, the community and the police feeling devastated and in shock.
Well, we're back now to square one. The mystery continues. The courts have cleared him. So who is it? Is it my neighbour? Is it my friend? Is it someone in my family? Is it someone I work with?
You always have to be open-minded, and you have to accept that actually Hamlin didn't do it. There is someone else out there.
With the case unsolved, the possibility of the killer getting away with murder looms over police.
Are the police looking for anyone else? Is the case closed? And the police were quite adamant that the case remained open, that they were carrying on their investigations.
So obviously we have a debrief. We'll meet with counsel as well. We'll speak with the family. We will conduct a review of that investigation to see if there were anything we missed, anything we could have done, mainly because so lessons can be learned, because once somebody's been acquitted, that's it.
Detectives go back to the drawing board and relook at all the evidence they have collated over the years and examine what went wrong.
We spent millions of pounds on this investigation, the most expensive investigations that Hampshire Police have ever run, and the forensic budget was through the roof.
Beforehand, they had looked for his DNA on the marble rolling pin, but graphically, there was so much of Georgina Edmonds' blood on that blurred everything, and they got just a partial sample. And then from another small part of her clothing, where again, it was a partial sample. I mean, you're asking a jury to put someone away for life on the grounds of circumstantial evidence and also partial DNA. It's too cloudy, and I think juries can then look at it and say, can I actually send a man away for life on evidence here which is not the strongest?
Police spend years looking for new techniques to forensically identify a killer. And they eventually come across a recent form of DNA testing called YSTR. which extracts the male DNA profile from a full DNA profile.
It's a simple process, and it's almost sellotape on clothing and points of the body to remove skin cells. So it's fairly early on in the exhibits that we've taken of the left sleeve of Georgina's blouse, which would have had skin cells on there. And so the decision was taken to look at those skin cells and examine them, because we hadn't done so far. We'd done the waistband, but not the sleeve. And then obviously it went for analysis, number crunching, etc. And it came back with a full male profile.
On Thursday, 30th of October 2014, police make an announcement. They have arrested and charged a suspect for the murder of Georgina Edmonds. As a new trial looms, people want to know, who is in the frame? None other than Matthew Hamlin.
This is incredible. They're going to put him back on trial. It wouldn't have been allowed because double jeopardy meant you could not be tried for the same crime in this country that had only been changed a few years prior to that, which enabled this to actually happen.
Despite the double jeopardy rules changing in 2003 and a new stack of DNA evidence, how did detectives manage to get Hamlin's charge over the line?
It's not an easy thing to do for obvious reasons. The defence argued that it's not new evidence, you had it all along, you just chose not to examine it and find it. But actually, it's not evidence until you've actually turned it into evidence. And that was the ruling of Sir Brian Leveson, who heard at the Court of Appeal, who then quashed the acquittal, and we were able to then go for a retrial.
January 2016, exactly 8 years after Georgina's murder, the second trial of Matthew Hamlin begins at Winchester Crown Court. The prosecution lay out all their evidence once again, including their new secret weapon, the YSTR DNA technique.
We were hoping for a better outcome this time.
It's 1 in 26 million, that DNA, that it's not him.
And when you describe that, you know, there's 26 million to 1 is this person, I think it was a fairly easy decision for the jury to make. Layered on top of that was, obviously, he was a local person, violent background, and obviously the phone was bouncing off the mast at the time.
Despite presenting their new evidence in court, there are many in the community who are unconvinced that Matthew Hamlin is the killer. At the time of the second trial, Matthew is a changed man, leaving behind his days of drug taking, working full-time as an electrician and raising his family. And after a grueling 6-week trial, the jury retires to consider the verdict.
When you do get to court and the prosecution and the defence have had their say and the judge has summed up, you still get a bit nervous, even though you just know in your heart of hearts that it's a really, really strong case.
So we can't speculate, we can't talk to people about, well, you know, what do you think this time? Do you think he's going to get off a second time?
On the 23rd of February 2016, the jury return with a verdict.
8 years after Georgina Edmonds, aged 77 years, was found dead at her home in Banbridge, Matthew Hamlin has today been found guilty of her brutal murder.
It was just a sense of relief and just great work, and so many people, bear in mind this investigation had gone on for years really, and so many people have got involved in that investigation. But it was just such a nice feeling.
Throughout this entire investigation, we have been absolutely determined to prove beyond reasonable doubt who committed this horrific crime. After the discovery of new evidence and presenting it to the Court of Appeal, we were able to try Matthew Hamlin again for the murder of Georgina Edmonds. The whole prosecution team were determined to find justice for Georgina, and today that has been achieved.
Being stood there, listening to Harry address the media and just say some really nice words about me and my colleagues and Hampshire Police and all the work that we had done to get justice for for the family. So, yeah, just a great feeling.
The entire team of police officers, police staff, prosecution barristers, forensic scientists and colleagues from the Crown Prosecution Service have been absolutely dedicated to putting together the best possible case that could be put before the court and the jury. Every moment has been worth it to see justice finally served and the killer of Georgina Edmonds behind bars. Thank you.
With Matthew Hamlin finally behind bars, the question that still puzzles the community is why would he want to end the life of Georgina Edmonds so brutally, torturing her before battering her to death?
Who can say, and it's difficult for me to speculate. Well, we know now from the court case, although he's never admitted it, that he was short of money, that he had walked along the riverbank and he had found his way in the cottage, whether that was just by pure chance, whether he had seen her walking her dogs and had known that she was gone there and she was a vulnerable old lady. Sadly, whether he would have known or not that the door was left open when he went in. He had tortured her to reveal the number for her debit card by stabbing her something like 27 times and then just leave her there, tie her up or something like that. But then it all got, who knows what it is. But I think what we can tell is that he is a pretty evil, nasty guy who will spend 30 years in prison.
And after 8 long years of fear, can normal life return for the local community?
It's so close to reality for us here that, you know, it's traumatic for all of us in the village.
They're vulnerable too. They're so trusting. I know we all felt very, very sorry for her. Yeah, very sorry.
It's Ethan Hunt's toughest choice yet. What's more important, his job or those he cares about most? With out-of-this-world stunts, the BAFTA-nominated Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning is available now on Sky Cinema.
Dog walkers came across the bin bags.
They find this is a disposal of some body parts.
The brutality of it, it was unbelievable.
It's what the psychos do.
It was a massive shock to everybody. Things don't happen like that in a community like this.
People just couldn't believe it. Obviously, it makes you scared.
You think, is there a serial killer on the loose? Is this gang-related?
And I got a phone call, and then my world fell apart. They were new, but I didn't know there was anything wrong.
Just south of Manchester, at the start of the River Mersey, sits Stockport.
Well, there's a lot of history with Stockport. There's the church behind here that goes 16th century.
Stockport's quite a quiet town. I grew up there, I was born there, raised there, went to school there, and there was a sense of community and people rallying round. If anything happens, there's a lot of support there, and if you're from Stockport, people sort of stick together from there.
People are very friendly, very nice, very approachable.
On the outskirts of Stockport, nestled amongst the serene surroundings of a leafy country park, is Brinnington.
I think Brinnington's an absolutely fantastic place to live. Everybody is a big family. Everybody looks out for each other, and it is a very tight-knit community.
For those wanting an escape from the hustle and bustle of nearby Stockport, locals can soak up the nature in Reddish Vale Country Park.
The Vale, it is a lovely place. We used to go out, we used to climb up the trees. It's just a kid's wildest dreams, isn't it? You can do what you want when you're down the Vale.
You get quite a lot of people fishing down there. a lot of people down there with the dogs and running and things like that. It's lovely, it's really nice.
But the tranquility of this country park was shattered one summer's morning.
It was all in lockdown, and so my granddaughter, she used to walk the dog for us every couple of days. And one day she came back. She said, just going down, she said, there was a big bag of meat there, Gran. Like bin bag, and it was all ripped open. I said, oh, so you didn't let our dog touch it, did you? She said, no, no, no. I wouldn't let her touch it. She went trying to sniff at it, but I just pulled her back. She said it didn't look very good, it was all green. She said, I think it was something from a butcher's. So, didn't think anything more about it.
But moments later, another dog walker grows suspicious.
Dog walkers came across the bin bags. They called into the police and reported, you know, that these bags had been found.
Dog walker walking in there sees a black bag and the dog's worrying the black bag. As soon as they open it, they can smell the bad smell. It will be a case of, I think, of what do I do now? And I expect the thing is to bring the police.
Alerted to the scene by a putrid smell coming from the bags, police inspect them, only to make a horrific discovery.
They find this is a disposal of some body parts.
Having identified some human remains in the bags, police secure the scene, and a murder investigation is immediately launched.
So the police officer turns up to the scene, finds parts of a body. Straight away, they'll be thinking, preservation, let's get some specialist teams down here. They've got to then put a cordon in the area so that nobody can come in and take pictures and disturb the scene. Most police officers will have seen dead bodies, but it's an entirely different kettle of fish, isn't it, when you're seeing a body cut up.
News of the shocking discovery quickly spreads, and local reporters rush to the scene.
There was a massive sense of urgency with this. We cover a lot of murders in Manchester, but nothing like this. We were just trying to establish what had happened. All that we knew was that a body's been found, dismembered in bin bags in a country park. That was just, it was unbelievable at the time.
As the story spreads, the local community struggles to come to terms with what's been found on their doorstep.
It was a massive shock to everybody. Things don't happen like that in a community like this. You know, how could somebody do that? It's absolutely horrific.
It rocked the community, the brutality of it. It shocked a lot of people.
People just couldn't believe it. You know, obviously it makes you scared, especially if it's just around the corner from where you live.
The shock of it, it just got about. It was just like it was more like when a rumour gets about. How do you drop a bag on the Vale with a human body in it? Do you know what I mean? It's what the psychos do.
News of the crime spreads fast. But the most important question on everyone's lips is, who is the victim?
The police will not know who that victim is at that moment. The family of that individual will not know that their loved one has died. So the police would have been looking at the missing persons register, because it's important to try and get to the family of that individual as quickly as possible.
But there's a problem. The bags contain only certain body parts, making an initial identification impossible. And it spreads fear amongst families in the local community.
For the residents, it was a very, very difficult situation. You might have people whose parents, daughters, sons didn't come home for one reason or the other. So they were being worried that it could have been their loved one.
The police have no idea who their victim is, and are no closer to knowing who could have possibly carried out this sickening crime.
The police will be trying to find the crime scene, because where the body is, the person has probably not been murdered there. They've just been parts of their body dumped there. You think, is there a serial killer on the loose? Is this gang related?
In the Stockport suburb of Brinnington, the community is waking up reeling after bin bags containing body parts were discovered in the local country park.
It's unusual to have a body dismembered. I can only think of 2 or 3 in my service in Greater Manchester.
Massive shock to everybody. You don't expect something like that to happen on your doorstep.
I've never heard anything like it before in my life. I couldn't believe it.
With the fears in the community growing, police specialists move in to examine the area.
There is an urgency taking place. It's like a huge juggernaut moving. They call it the golden hour, and it isn't an hour. It's the time that you're going to get the best evidence and the best opportunities to catch the killer and get main lines of inquiry. You will have police forensic teams sent out to the scene. You will have scientists looking at blood pattern analysis, looking at body deposition. The coroner from the area will be called out. So there's a whole group of people that are going to get involved in this from a very early stage.
News of the gruesome discovery has spread like wildfire, and local reporters are on the scene. But while forensic officers have the delicate task of trawling the crime scene, in a bid to identify the victim, the cause of death, and find clues to the killer, the media frenzy threatens to scupper the investigation from the off.
It's difficult for the police to keep ahead of the media frenzy. The media, they can be down and they can be knocking on doors in the area. They want to get in there and get the story.
We sent a reporter down there. We spoke to the community, we spoke to neighbours, and then we sent a photographer down there as well.
Photos from the scene are shared online, much to the concern of investigators.
When it got put on Facebook, that's how most people really did find out through that.
One of the big issues for investigators at a crime scene like this is media and social media. Everybody wants to take photographs. Everybody wants to pass that out. It can be around the world, and let's say it takes 3 days to identify that individual because there's got to be some scientific analysis. Well, the family might have been looking at this for days on end.
With the images spreading online, time is running out before news gets to the family.
There's a number of ways that the police can try and identify an individual. It's been perfected over the years. You've got fingerprints, you've got tattoos, marks, you've got dental, you've got DNA.
Now we're into the phase of looking at that body in detail for marks, for injuries, things like that. As you carry on and dissect to look for evidence, this is all about the detail of what that body is telling you.
After examining the remains, experts find a tattoo on one of the body parts. Could this be key to identifying the victim? Then, suddenly, 9 hours after the discovery, police receive a call, reporting a local resident missing. She is 46-year-old Yvonne McCann, known as Vonnie.
The first thing, obviously, we realise that my sister's missing, and then the second thing we see on Facebook is that body parts have been found. So then, you're putting 2 and 2 together, aren't you?
Yvonne's sister, Helen, had been watching the police drama unfold before her eyes, unaware of the devastating impact it was about to have on her life.
I sat in my garden, looking at the police on the Vale, texting my sister. What's going on? It looks really bad. What's going on? Have you heard anything, Von? I didn't get any response, but I didn't think anything of it. Didn't even know she was missing.
Police request that one of Yvonne's family head to the scene to establish whether the victim is indeed their loved one or someone else entirely.
One of my nephews had been up to see a body part with a tattoo on it, so that proved that it was our Yvonne. I was shocked. I was empty. I had no feelings. I didn't have a tear in my eye. I couldn't cry. I think I was just in disbelief and shock. The way we lost her, the way she was found, the indignity of being found like that.
Early hours of the morning, we'd gone to bed and I got a phone call off my brother Charlie saying they think that's our Yvonne. And then my world fell apart. I was meant to protect her. Never knew, but I didn't know. Didn't know there was anything wrong.
News that one of their own has been taken from them hits locals hard.
The whole community was subdued for a few weeks, to be honest, because everybody knew Vonnie. When you normally pass somebody and you say hi to them and then suddenly they're not there to say hi to, it was very, very tragic, very tragic.
Yvonne was well known to locals, having lived in Brinnington her whole life.
She was the youngest, you know, she's the apple of my dad's eye, shall we say. She was a lovely girl. She's very mischievous. She was loud, she was bright, she had a great sense of humour, you know, and she was good fun to be with.
She was a baby. She got away with stuff that me and my brother never did. I think they give up. After me and my brother, they must have given up. She used to drive me nutty when we got to the teenage stage, and she used to run after me all the time and want to hang about with me. She was just funny. I wish she could hang about with me now. But at the time, you don't think of that, do you?
During her teenage years, Yvonne found her first love with local lad Thomas McCann.
Yvonne and Thomas were definitely childhood sweethearts. She was about 14 when she met Tommy. From there, she was just always a Tom. Tom was the man.
She was 14 when she met him, and he was a few years older. They were both devoted to each other.
A lot of people meet at a young age, and sometimes your first love is just your first love, and you grow apart. Well, they never grew apart, they just grew stronger.
In 1996, 8 years into their relationship, Yvonne and Thomas tied the knot and started a family together.
Yvonne had 3 children with Thomas. They were married, and Thomas was a family man, hard-working man. He worked as a takeaway delivery driver in Stockport.
She loved him to bits, and he loved her. And they stayed together for all them years because there was a strong bond between them.
However, in 2012, after 24 years together, the relationship sadly came to an end. Yet Yvonne and Thomas remained friends and continued to live under the same roof. And eventually, Yvonne started dating again.
She moved on to a new relationship and things appeared to go well.
He's a nice bloke and he wanted to look after her. He made her feel good.
Life for Yvonne was good. But in March 2020, during the UK's period of lockdown, she moved back in with Thomas, who she was still on friendly terms with, in order to spend more time with her children. But in May 2020, just hours before a planned family barbecue, Yvonne texts family to say she's not coming, and then disappears, prompting her worried ex Thomas to take matters into his own hands.
At that point, Thomas reported that she was missing.
So what could possibly have led this well-known mother to be killed in such a horrific way?
When a body is dismembered, as an investigator, you've got to look at why it's been dismembered. So in this case, it's put in black bin liners and discarded on a park. It's not a case of trying to hide the body. That seems to me to be a knee-jerk reaction. This person doesn't know what they want to do with the body. You know, this is not a criminal mastermind. This didn't look like some kind of serial killer. It's not gang-related where they've taken some time, like you see on some of the films. It is a quick, hurried deposit of some body parts.
Police now begin to suspect that whoever was responsible for this sickening crime was local to the area.
One of the things I thought about on this is there's some science behind where criminals operate. You, I, everybody else will have an area where we operate a daily business. We'll go to the same pubs, we'll go to the same shops, we'll meet the same friends at the same locations. And if you look at that, this is how criminals operate. Because they'll carry out the crime, they'll know places where they feel that they can deposit stuff and they can get away and not be compromised.
With Yvonne's home a mere stone's throw from where her body was found, attention falls on her inner circle.
You want to be with the families very quickly. One, for that reassurance, but secondly, to identify, have they got any idea of how it occurred, who could have done it, or was it within the family? You want to look at possible partners, friends, and people that they've had arguments with. That gives me a smaller pool of people to look at than trying to look at every gang member in Greater Manchester to see whether they've killed this woman.
Police begin by speaking to Yvonne's ex-husband, Thomas McCann. Thomas tells police that he last saw Yvonne on the Saturday morning, 2 days before her body was found. She left home to meet her new partner. Detectives speak to him, but he tells them that Yvonne never turned up. And after some delving into his whereabouts on the day, police rule the new partner out of the investigation. So where had Yvonne gone? And who would want her dead?
We didn't know if she'd just had an argument and gone to her boyfriend. We didn't know if she'd had an argument and gone to see a friend. You know what I mean? We didn't know.
As Yvonne's family prepare to say their goodbyes, suddenly police make an announcement.
A man has been arrested on suspicion of murder after a woman's body was found on Reddish Vale Country Park earlier this morning. The suspect has been taken into custody and detained for questioning.
It was a big shock to everybody. Nobody ever expected it at all.
It's been a matter of hours since human remains were found in Brinnington, and the body has been identified as that of 46-year-old mum, Yvonne McCann, and police have made an arrest.
One of my nephews knocked on his door and says, I've come to tell you my dad's been arrested for a murder.
Yvonne's ex-husband, 49-year-old Thomas McCann, is arrested and taken into police custody.
It's unfathomable to even think something like that could happen.
And as Yvonne's loved ones try to make sense of this shocking news, the community rallies together to show its support.
Our family's a very well-known family. We were born and bred Brinnington, so it affected everybody. It wasn't just the family, the estate. It affected the estate. People couldn't believe it, you know, and the response, the messages of people, and we had lockdown here. We had lockdown. And even in lockdown, there must have been 300 people on this front. And by the way, they was all trying their best to stay safe. But how can you stop 300 people coming to show their respects?
Despite the incredible support from the local community, the interrogation of Yvonne's ex-husband Thomas in connection with her death continues. So what had led to the arrest of the father of 3 of Yvonne's children? Police had recently learnt that on Saturday morning, 2 days before Yvonne's body was found, there had been an argument between Yvonne and Thomas.
Yvonne and Thomas had argued in the morning. The neighbours had heard them arguing from about 9 o'clock.
They had an argument over a bag of chips, apparently.
She'd messaged her neighbour saying, you know, I've left a bag of frozen chips out. And that was that.
While in custody, Thomas tells police that after the argument over the frozen chips, Yvonne left their home to go and see her new partner. He then tells police the following day he was invited to a family barbecue.
Both him and Yvonne had been invited to a family barbecue by their son. And Yvonne, she'd messaged her son saying she wouldn't go. And there'd been an argument, and there was a few messages exchanged to do with that.
Yvonne's texts made it clear she didn't want to join Thomas at the barbecue. But he still went and stayed there until late in the evening.
He went to walk home. His daughter was helping him home because he was drunk. He passed out. And then that's when his daughter found the rings and, I believe, her mobile phone in his jacket pocket and began questioning where her mum was.
When confronted by his daughter, Thomas explains why he had Yvonne's possessions with him. And he gives a different story to the one he initially gave to the police.
After, they'd had this argument, he said he met her on Hempshire Lane, which is in Stockport. He said he was going to give her a lift to the new partner's house, and during which she gave him her wedding rings for safekeeping. And that her phone had fallen into the footwell of his car, so he'd got those off her and then dropped her off at the new partner's house.
Her phone and rings were found in his pocket, so that heightens the senses of the SAO that this might be the individual we're looking at.
But the police still have no hard evidence to link Thomas to the crime.
I would be getting a search warrant for that property. You'd want to do a forensic examination in the home. One of the first things I'd be doing when I went in the house would be getting the bath and the plumbing looked at, because there'll be residue in the bath, there'll be residue in the pipes all the way down to the plumbing.
Officers searched Thomas and Yvonne's address, but forensics failed to find anything incriminating.
The house was spotless. From what I can gather, there was nothing found DNA-wise, there was nothing found there in the house that could prove that anybody had been killed in that house.
With no forensic evidence found at the address, police scour local CCTV in an attempt to confirm whether Thomas had indeed travelled to Stockport to meet Yvonne on the Saturday.
Thomas gives an explanation of where he went between certain times. The teams will look at any CCTV to see whether they confirm his story, because what you're trying to do is you're either trying to confirm or deny what he's saying.
And in a major breakthrough, police do uncover CCTV focusing on the street outside Yvonne and Thomas's home. But there's no sign of Yvonne leaving the address at any point. Despite Thomas's insistence to police that she'd walked out after the pair had argued over frozen chips.
It was 9 to 10 o'clock in the morning. He was seen going outside 4 times, moving things from his truck. Why he was doing that, we don't know. But then from about 10 o'clock, he was inside the house. And then he wasn't seen again until 4 o'clock.
Having spent the day indoors, Thomas McCann is seen leaving the address. But it's what he's seen carrying which really sparks police interest.
Thomas McCann left the house with bin bags.
Has Thomas been caught red-handed on CCTV carrying his ex-wife's remains? Further examination of the cameras shows Thomas returns home at 10:47 p.m. and heads out again just before 1 a.m. Shortly after leaving, his car is spotted on CCTV, parked at Bredbury Recycling Centre on the outskirts of Stockport. Police immediately dispatch officers to the scene.
It was at the recycling centre where more body parts were found.
The body parts are quickly identified as those of Yvonne McCann. Tools, including a Stanley knife, are also discovered at the scene. And Thomas is confronted with the damning evidence against him.
The officers have asked him the questions, he's given him an answer, they've gone away, they've come back and said, come on Thomas, that's not right. And here you are with a load of bin liners. What were you disposing of and where did you take him? People do become upset. A lot of them become angry because they're being found out. The story isn't right. The true craft of an interviewer is to get a person talking. If you can get that rapport going with that individual, you can get that little chink, you know, you need to do this for your kids, you need to do this for her. It can turn it. And that's the true craft of turning somebody to talk to you.
There was 4 police interviews. At the 4th interview, when he was accompanied by a solicitor, he handed in a statement saying, "I've killed my wife, I've killed Yvonne, and disposed of her like garbage."
Thomas McCann is charged with the murder of his ex-wife, Yvonne McCann.
You think, it's something that doesn't happen to you. It's something that doesn't happen in your family. It's something that happens in America. Do you understand what I'm saying? It doesn't happen in Brinnington. Something like that doesn't happen on your doorstep, and it definitely doesn't happen to your sister.
But the question troubling the police is the motive. Why would Thomas murder his childhood sweetheart and mother of his children? Four days since the human remains of Yvonne McCann were found in a park near the Stockport suburb of Brinnington, the community wakes to the shocking news that her ex-husband, 49-year-old delivery driver Thomas McCann, has confessed to her murder.
Yvonne and Thomas were childhood sweethearts, which I think makes it all the more surprising that this happened, really.
He's not only killed his wife, he's also mutilated her body as well. How anybody could do that, I'll never know.
Ten months after Yvonne's murder, Thomas appears at Manchester Crown Court to enter a formal plea. And the question the family are desperate to be answered is, why did Yvonne's once-loving husband end her life in such a brutal way? Could it really be over a bag of frozen chips?
This was the first that anyone had heard the proper details of the case, and it was the first time in open court that the public would hear of the details of the case, so it was a very tense atmosphere. There was the family sat upstairs in the public gallery at the back, and then Thomas McCann in the dock. Thomas seemed really normal when I saw him in court. He was in a blue suit, he looked quite smart. You wouldn't look at him to think he'd done something like that, but you could say that about any murderers, couldn't you?
My side of the family, we weren't in the same courtroom because of COVID. We wasn't allowed. We was by camera.
I never went to court. I didn't want him to see me, because if he sees me and I show any emotion at all, he's won.
Thomas formally pleads guilty to the murder of his ex-wife, meaning he wouldn't have to give a defence revealing any motive for the killing.
I think Thomas pleaded guilty to stop his family from hearing all the gory details of what went on. That way he didn't have to tell his side of the story.
He knew that a few of the family were going to go to court, so he pleaded guilty, so there wasn't a court case. No one even had a say on the matter.
With Thomas pleading guilty to the crime, the family is denied hearing a motive for the murder. Could the answer lie in their 24-year relationship, which started when they met as teenagers?
I think she just fell head over heels with him. And I think, oh, this is a fairy tale. But it wasn't a fairy tale. Every couple of months we used to say, oh, is Thomas still at home? Going off with every woman he set eyes on. And she'd forgive him over and over and over again.
No matter what you said to her, Bonnie, she wouldn't believe it. My Thomas wouldn't do that. My Thomas wouldn't do that.
Over the years, the strain of the relationship took its toll on Yvonne, and she reached out to her brother and sister for help.
We all said, it'll never be no good. And she used to just fall to pieces. And we used to pick the pieces up. And in the end, you know, you can't keep saying, leave him, because it doesn't work. She had to be ready to do that.
My sister come round, our Yvonne, and said, you know, can you go and chuck him out, or can you go and have a word with him, can you sort it out? Now, I used to do that for her. Nothing ever involved violence, just strong talking. But you knew you was wasting your time because within a day or two, he'd be back. So after maybe 10 years of actually trying to sort it out, I did say to her, Yvonne, you know, you have trouble now, don't come to see me. When you want him gone, get him gone yourself.
Yvonne remained with Thomas. But as the years rolled on, she became more and more vulnerable.
She was a very mentally strong person, don't get me wrong, but, you know, as time went on, she got weaker and weaker as things went wrong. You know, dogs dying, parents dying. When my mum died, she believed a lot in ghosts, Yvonne, and afterlife. She used to go and see psychics and things like that. All of a sudden, all sorts of little things are moving around. You've got all your ornaments and things like that are moving around. Things are appearing from nowhere. And Yvonne's thinking, it's my mum and my dad, you know. And it wasn't my mum and dad, it was Thomas messing around with her head. I think that's exactly what he was doing.
As far as I'm aware, there was nothing physical. There was no physical abuse, but there was something. I think it was like mental torture to her.
Eventually, in 2012, Yvonne built up the strength to end her relationship with Thomas.
She'd had enough, and she wanted out. So she moved out, she moved away from the trouble.
Yvonne then met her new partner. But despite this, Thomas kept a tight grip on Yvonne.
Thomas wouldn't let go. You know, he'd threaten to jump off bridges, things like that. If you don't stay with me, I'm going to jump off this bridge. If you don't stay with me, I'm going to drink this bleach. If you don't stay with me, I'm going to take these tablets.
He was stood on the bridge numerous times near where she lived, threatening to jump. He went disappearing one time. He just disappeared. And then he turned up again. And I think it was constant mind games.
Despite recently moving in with her new partner, Yvonne, concerned over Thomas's well-being, felt she had no choice but to move back in with her ex-husband.
She went back, but she didn't want to be there. She wanted that fresh start. She wanted that fresh start, and she wasn't allowed that fresh start. She couldn't get rid of him. He wouldn't go. That is what happened towards the end.
In March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic hit the UK, and a national lockdown meant that Yvonne and Thomas would be spending more time together than usual.
All of a sudden, you're stuck in the same house together for months. It's going to have effects on some people. For our Yvonne to be spending all that time with Thomas, I don't think it would have been a good thing, you know.
2 months into lockdown, Yvonne pays her brother a visit, which tragically would be the last time he saw her.
The last time I spoke to her was the Thursday before she was murdered. She come round the house, and Yvonne was talking to my wife and saying, you know, he's going through my phone. I wake up in the night or in the morning, he's sat at the end of the bed looking at me. She said, I don't feel comfortable. She knew herself that there was something not right with him. And in that conversation, she actually said to me that if I am ever found dead, it's him that's done it. And that was words out of her mouth the Thursday before the day she disappeared. If I am ever found dead, it's him that's done it.
Days later, on the morning of Saturday the 23rd of May 2020, a neighbour hears an argument coming from Yvonne and Thomas's home. They then receive a text from Yvonne saying the pair were arguing over frozen chips being left out. But was this really the motive for the murder?
All I can think is that I'd lost control of her. Maybe they had the conversation and she said, well, I am going. Maybe that's what triggered it off. Maybe she decided, right, Tom, I'm going, and he thought, well, you're not. You're not going anywhere. Makes more sense to me than arguing over a bag of chips. Certainly does. He's the only one that knows.
The motive may be unclear, but police discover what Thomas did next. And it's truly horrifying.
He strangled Yvonne, and then, we believe using a Stanley knife and some lopping shears, he dismembered the body. I think that's what took so long for him to do. That's why he was in the house for so long.
Police also discover that after killing his ex-wife, Thomas had used Yvonne's phone pretending to be her.
So whilst he was dismembering Yvonne's body, he was messaging the family using her phone, messaging himself using her phone and replying. He was apologising to her about the bag of frozen chips, telling her he still loved her. All this was carrying on whilst he was committing that act.
So he's trying to manufacture a narrative there, so that when he's asked questions, say, oh, well, I was speaking to her at these times, and then these are messages, and if she's died before then, well, she died afterwards.
The court hears that in a prepared statement, McCann had told police he had strangled Yvonne and cut her body up in order to make her go away. He then disposed of her body parts and the tools he had used, and then shockingly joined his family for a barbecue that his son had invited both parents to attend the next day.
He didn't show any remorse. How can that be remorseful? Just carrying on after he'd murdered and dismantled my sister. Carrying on like he'd done nothing. I'll just go and have a barbecue with my family. Just carry on pretending I'm my wife on her phone. No, that wasn't sorry. He can say sorry as much as he wanted in court to the family. That shows me he was never sorry.
The court is also told that only 50% of Yvonne's body has ever been found.
Other parts of the body were still not found. They've not found the head.
The family will never get complete closure in that aspect until she's returned as a whole. There's always that part of my loved one is still out there, and hopefully one day it'll be found.
On the 30th of March 2021, the judge imposes his sentence. Thomas McCann is sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 12 years behind bars.
My side of the family just got up and walked out. I was gobsmacked.
There was a number of things which reduced the sentence. Part of it was reduced due to his guilty plea. Another part was due to mitigating circumstances such as his mental state at the time. He had mental health issues. There was alcohol abuse there. From what we know, he suffered with horrendous abuse as a child in every way imaginable. But you'd think a brutal murder like that, the way he disposed of the body, you know, people who've murdered people in the past have got much higher sentences for doing a lot less than what he did.
What's that message about that 12 years sent out to other people that are thinking of getting rid of the wife because they've had enough of her, eh? Can't afford to divorce her, can't do this, I'll murder her. I'll get 12 years. It's disgusting, absolutely disgusting. They should be ashamed of themselves.
I could never forgive him. Never. He took my sister away. He took a part of me away with him that day, and a part of my brother as well.
I could never forgive him for what he's done to not just me, the family. It's what he's done to everybody. It's up to him now to do something with himself. It's up to him to realise what he's done and let him do his time. But when it comes to forgiveness, no, I can't forgive the man. No, I can't. No.
With Thomas now behind bars, The community of Brinnington struggles to come to terms with the horror of what happened to Yvonne.
The neighbours, everybody, even now still feel it. Because obviously, you know, children left without a mum, and it's just thrown their life, probably for the rest of their lives, into turmoil. Very, very sad, very sad.
And Yvonne's elder siblings are slowly coming to terms with a life without her.
The way you're moving on is to keep yourself busy. Don't let things get into your head. We're not going to let him destroy my life, my wife's life, my family's life, my kids' life. We're not going to let him do it. We're going to get on and we're going to be even stronger. And that's how you get through things.
I'll never be able to understand why she's no longer here. And the nightmares, the constant lack of sleep, since wondering who she was shouting for while he was strangling her, because she'd have been shouting for somebody to help her. And we didn't, and we couldn't, because we didn't know.
There's more shocking true crime Wednesday at 9 on Sky Mix, when a victim of circumstance is in the wrong place at the wrong time in New Murdered at First Sight.
If you have been affected by any of the issues raised in this programme, help is available online at sky.com/viewer support.
Is there anyone with a medical background on board? We need to hurry. An elderly person needs help. I used to be a doctor, I said, raising my hand. Please help us, urged by a beautiful flight attendant. I proceeded to the front of the plane. This is the story of a once brilliant surgeon who was ousted from the medical world and encountered a crisis while returning to his rural hometown by plane. My name is Eugene. I was a doctor until just the other day. I was a neurosurgeon at a university hospital, and since my residency, I was favored by the professor, which allowed me to accompany him to conferences even ahead of other senior doctors. Soon after, a paper I presented at a conference was recognized, and at the age of 29, I was hailed as a genius neurosurgeon. As my fame increased from TV appearances and writing magazine columns, my clinic became so popular that there was a 2-month wait for an appointment. The hospital's policy was that while general appointments took 2 months, celebrities and the like were given priority in treatment. I primarily cared for patients in VIP private rooms, alongside my mentor and chief physician, Dr. Maxwell. My smooth career began to derail after Dr. Maxwell retired. Dr. Maxwell was a significant figure within the hospital's power dynamics, having been a powerful ally as a friend of the hospital director, Dr. Smith. Under Dr. Maxwell's protection, all I had to think about was maximizing my skills. After his retirement, the position of head of neurology was to be filled by an external hire, and it remained vacant for a while. Already holding the title of associate professor, I was temporarily assigned as the acting head, representing the department and coordinating with other medical divisions. There were many in the hospital who did not take kindly to my presence. Without Dr. Maxwell's backing, I found myself at the forefront of troublesome office politics. The especially problematic person was Dr. Vincent, the deputy director and head of surgery, who was notoriously harsh and often clashed with me. Despite this, since Dr. Vincent also primarily handled VIP cases, we had to cooperate frequently. At that time, Dr. Vincent was the primary physician for a famous singer, whose hospitalization itself was newsworthy. One day, I participated in a pre-surgical conference for this patient. The surgery would be performed by Dr. Vincent, of course, but there was a disagreement between my diagnosis and his. Despite repeatedly presenting the imaging and explaining, my views were dismissed, and none of the other doctors dared to contradict Dr. Vincent. Eventually, Dr. Vincent decided my diagnosis was wrong and proceeded with a different treatment. The patient did not survive. It was clear that the cause was Dr. Vincent's misdiagnosis and surgical error. However, he shifted all the blame onto me. I was blamed for the patient's death due to my supposed misdiagnosis. In this hospital, going against Dr. Vincent meant not being able to survive. Although a few nurses and pharmacists spoke out in my defense, they were dismissed as a warning to others. No doctor was willing to speak the truth, and I was left to take the fall alone, resulting in my departure from the hospital. My medical error, sensationalized by the media, effectively ended my future as a doctor. Disgusted with the world of medicine and losing my passion for saving lives, I decided to return to my rural hometown to take over the family inn. It's about a 2-hour flight to my hometown. Normally, I would have flown first class, but this time I bought an economy class ticket and waited for boarding, and then in the lounge, which was noisy due to first-class passengers. A younger men were loudly celebrating with a few older men. Other passengers frowned at their unrefined behavior, but they continued their loud conversations, which were clearly audible. Derek is the main guest at tomorrow's conference. It's unprecedented for someone his age to be a professor. From such conversations, it was evident. Some doctors and their entourage were heading to a conference. The doctor, clearly younger than the others, was being flattered and acting superior. Well, it's a world I no longer belong to. Once on the plane, I started to read a book. After takeoff, it wasn't long before there was a commotion up front. Apparently, there was a medical emergency in first class. Sure enough, the doctors from the lounge were also on the same flight. There was no role for me to play. I realize that I'm thinking about this. I've quit being a doctor. I'm just an ordinary person now. Just when I thought it had quieted down, a flight attendant rushed in from first class in a fluster. "Is there a doctor on board?" It was a phrase I often heard during my active days. There were doctors headed to a conference in first class. From the content of their pompous conversation, I guessed they were from a major hospital. Had they not attended to the patient? Excuse me, aren't there some doctors from a hospital in first class? When I raised my hand and called out to the frantic flight attendant, she looked at me as if grasping at straws. "Are you a doctor? Could you please help us?" My gesture caused a misunderstanding, but I was curious why those doctors hadn't responded, so I followed the attendant without clearing up the confusion. Upon reaching first class, it was chaotic. A group of doctors from the lounge before boarding were surrounding an elderly couple, attempting to administer treatment. "What should we do, Derek? It's not subsiding," said a man anxiously observing the patient, addressing the youngest and most authoritative among them. The elderly man was having a seizure and had lost consciousness. "Ma'am, is this the first time your husband has had an epileptic seizure?" Derek, the man addressed as such, spoke to the woman who was pale and holding her husband's hand. "Epilepsy. This is the first I've heard of it. Is my husband having an epileptic seizure?" These symptoms are definite. While individual reactions may vary, they should stabilize soon. It's important to keep him lying on his side to monitor his condition. Your husband is lucky to have me treating him. His entourage nodded in agreement. After all, Derek is the next chairman of the American Neurosurgical Society. He's an authority in this field. Being on this plane was a stroke of luck. They praised Derek in chorus. As I was led through this exchange by the flight attendant, I found myself standing before the patient. Despite having quit medicine, the patient's symptoms and possible diagnosis instantly came to mind. Ma'am, was your husband taking any medication for high blood pressure? Yes, my husband has high blood pressure and regularly receives medication for it, the wife responded to my inquiry. Hearing this, I directed Derek and his group. This is a case of hyponatremia. Derek, administer saline immediately. Since I had quit medicine, I no longer carried emergency medical supplies as I used to. What? Who do you think you are giving orders to? Derek isn't someone that a doctor who can only afford economy class should be talking to. His group confronted me aggressively. Someone, anyone, please prepare an IV quickly. Severe hyponatremia can closely mimic epileptic seizures, it's common knowledge in neurology. Derek's entourage started murmuring among themselves. Is Derek's diagnosis incorrect? That can't be. They exchanged confused glances. Meanwhile, the man's seizures started again. If a respected doctor lets a patient die on a plane, he might as well be erased from the medical society, I said firmly. One of the entourage finally called a nurse from economy class, and they began administering an IV to the patient. You guys, do whatever you want. Everyone fell silent, watching Derek's reactions. After the plane landed, I was urged to accompany the patient to the ambulance waiting on the tarmac. I hesitated honestly. It's such a rural place. Nobody here knows me. I reassured myself and was about to board the ambulance when Derek yelled, "Know your place, bumpkin, you've embarrassed me." At the hospital, I explained the situation to the doctor and reported the treatment and medication administered. Thanks to the appropriate measures, the patient will be able to go home soon. By the way, Dr. Fumpson, which hospital do you work at? The doctor praised my intervention and asked. No, I used to run a clinic, but I closed it down and am on my way back to my hometown. I brushed it off with a casual lie. The doctor accepted it easily, saying, "It's a shame for someone as skilled as you." After ensuring the man was stable, I silently left the hospital. I felt like I recognized the patient's face somehow, but I quickly forgot about it as I hurried back to my family home. When I arrived, my parents and my brother and his wife, who help run the family inn, all